agenda in time for this State of the Union. What is your assessment of how President Biden has handled Ukraine and Russia so far?
I think at the beginning, Judy, they were reactive. I think it took them a little bit of time. I don't think everybody was sort of trying to assess and calibrate what Russia may or may not do. But I think now they're doing the right things. I think the economic sanctions and getting the alliance together behind those. I mean, the way to make the sanctions effective is to make sure that we are unified in implementing them. And I think the administration has done a nice job of getting the Germans and the French and all of our NATO allies involved and together on that. And I think they are doing the right things in terms of providing lethal aid. We were briefed last night by all the relevant players, and coming out of that, I felt like the administration clearly understands what's at stake here and is doing everything they can to make sure that the Ukrainians can defend themselves against this sort of murderous thug that is coming in and invading their sovereign country.
At the same time, the Russians don't seem to be deterred. They have been slowed, but I don't think very many people think they are not going to keep pushing forward. What more do you believe the West, that the United States can do to help the Ukrainians?
I think that we are doing most of what we can. There are a few things we could do additional. I think that the energy sanctions, Putin, obviously, their entire economy revolves around energy. Some people have described it as a gas station masquerading as a country. So if we were collectively to do that, I think that could be a very punishing blow again to their economy. But you've already seen the ruble crash as a result of some of these sanctions. I think the people of Russia are going to become very frustrated with what's happening there. That, you're right, that won't deter. I think for him, this is all now about saving face, and he's a desperate man. He could do desperate things, and I think we have to be prepared for the worst. But we are doing everything we can in terms of arming the Ukrainians, giving them intelligence capabilities, training, lethal aid, all those things that they need. And I'm hoping that it will be costly enough for Putin as he tries to move into the interior of the country that he will make a calculation that this is a really bad idea. And I think the other thing that's starting to take effect is, surprisingly, I mean, you get things that haven't happened in decades. Switzerland is coming off the sidelines. The Russian people are rising up against their leader. And I think that sort of thing is going to be very, very determinative in ultimately whether or not Putin can continue this. You're right. I think he's moving, and he can apply as much force as is necessary to get there. But I think it's going to be very costly, both in form of casualties and to the Russian people when it comes to the economic effect these sanctions are having.
Senator, some members of your party, however, have been praising Vladimir Putin, in particular former President Trump. He's called him a genius, savvy. Just over the weekend, he doubled down. He called him smart. And he said, while our leaders, American leaders, are dumb. What do you make? Do you agree with his assessment?
I think that Vladimir Putin is now exposed to all the world can see. This is a guy. This is a power grab on his part. He is a thug. He is a criminal. He has to be stopped. And I think that's going to be the view of not only a huge majority of Americans, but a huge majority of the world, which is why everybody is now stepping up and providing assistance. It's really remarkable to see, and encouraging, frankly, to see the number of countries around the world that are stepping into this equation and doing everything they can to help and assist. But no, Vladimir Putin clearly is a menace to the world, and it's important that the world stop him, and this is the place to do it. And I'm glad that everybody is stepping up to the task.
So you're saying former President Trump is wrong in that assessment?
Well, I don't. Former presidents can have their own opinions, but I can tell you what everybody else can see clearly, and that is that this is a man who is deluded and, frankly, I think a very desperate person, but someone who has no qualms about murdering innocent people and children, and he has to be stopped. And there will be no question about that. There is no question about that. And anybody who suggests otherwise, I think is not watching what's unfolding in front of them.
Last question, Senator, back to the State of the Union. What should President Biden say tonight is the State of the Union right now?
Well, I think when you get back home, I mean, he's going to talk a lot about Ukraine, and obviously there's going to be a high level of interest in the chamber about that subject and what steps we can work together with them on as members of Congress. But I think on the domestic agenda, Judy, he's got a lot of work to do. Inflation's at a 40-year high. His approval ratings are in the tank, and the border's a mess. There are a lot of crime issues in our cities, safety issues that people are concerned with. And an energy crisis. I mean, gasoline prices are already, going through the roof, and the situation abroad is not going to help with that. So he's got a case I think he needs to make about how he's going to conduct himself differently this next year than he has the past year. I think the last year it's been very partisan. It's been sort of a left-wing agenda with a very narrow majority in the House and Senate. And I think in the second year of his term, he could pivot to and look at how he can work together to accomplish things in a constructive way to try and solve some of these problems for the American people. But clearly the formula that they've been using certainly hasn't worked, at least as it pertains to the runaway inflation that we're seeing and some of the other adverse economic impacts of his policies.
Senator John Thune, the second-ranking Republican in the Senate. We're going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Judy. Nice to be with you.
And now for a Democrat's take, let's bring in Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. He's also a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. Senator Coons, welcome back to the NewsHour. Let me ask you first about Ukraine. We just heard Senator Thune saying that after getting off to a rocky start, not being reactive in the beginning, that he thinks President Biden is handling the Ukraine crisis well. How much does it matter that you have what appears to be, right now, a largely bipartisan support for the U.S. approach?
Well, Judy, it's important that we show bipartisan support for President Biden's leadership. And I'm glad to hear that Senator Thune recognizes that President Biden has brought the West together to impose crushing sanctions on Vladimir Putin and Putin's Russia, and that those sanctions will make this unjustified, brutal invasion of Ukraine cost Russia and the Russian people. I do think he should give credit where credit's due to President Biden for all the hard work he did over the last year, improving our alliances, strengthening our partnerships, because frankly, his predecessor spent a lot of his 4 years dividing the United States from NATO, from the EU, from some of our longest and closest alliances. President Biden put in the time repairing those partnerships and laying the groundwork for what we're now seeing, which is decisive leadership in the face of Russian aggression.
How confident are you, Senator Coons, that the two parties are now united in whatever else needs to be done urgently to support the Ukrainian people?
I was in a meeting last night with 24 senators and the Ukrainian ambassador, and I'm confident that we've got enough bipartisan support to deliver a strong supplemental package of funding that'll provide both financial assistance for refugees, for our vital allies that are receiving hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees, and that will provide continued military support for arming the Ukrainian resistance. Judy, the whole world has been fixed to their TVs and their social media devices, watching President Zelensky and thousands of brave Ukrainians standing up to and fighting to a standstill the massive Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think the developments of the coming weeks will be very tough, at times even grim, but it's important that Ukraine and Ukrainians know that the United States and all of the Western allies who care about democracy and freedom have their back and will continue to provide them with support. And having bipartisan support here in the Congress for that is a critical piece of the United States showing up in this critical moment.
Moving on to the State of the Union address tonight, Senator, you know the president very well. We just heard Senator Thune. We're hearing it from other Republicans. This is a president who's had a rough first year. Even Democrats acknowledge it's been a rough year. Senator Thune was ticking off inflation, the price of energy, the problems at the border. Just how rough a year has it been? How large are the challenges facing this president going into year two?
We have significant challenges facing our country, but President Biden also has a real record of substantial accomplishment. His predecessor talked about infrastructure. President Biden and a bipartisan group of us here in the Senate got it done. He signed into law the biggest infrastructure investment package in modern American history. We've delivered more vaccinations than I think anyone thought might be possible. 4/5 of all Americans over the age of 5 have been vaccinated. We've got an unemployment rate that's below 4%. Last year, we saw a near record amount of growth and new jobs created for the first year of any modern presidency. But President Biden will acknowledge there are real challenges facing working families, facing families all across our country in terms of inflation, concerns about the future, and frankly, just exhaustion with this ongoing pandemic. President Biden believes in the American people, and he will lay out tonight his vision for how we can come together, tackle the problems that remain, and come through this stronger than ever.
How confident are you, though, that when it comes to inflation, how much can a president do to reassure the American people that they're not going to continue to suffer because of rising prices?
He can do a lot to tackle inflation, but it takes time. Inflation takes time to build up in an economy, and it takes time to go away. The Federal Reserve, of course, has an absolutely critical role, and global events that we have a hard time controlling or driving, such as a potential increase in food costs or fuel or energy costs because of the war in Ukraine, may have an impact that President Biden can't make go away with a magic wand. But his administration has shown determination and focus on dealing with supply chain issues, on straightening out issues at our ports as a result of the pandemic, and he's going to lay out a clear path forward for how we can tackle the daily costs of living, like prescription drug costs, healthcare costs, daycare costs. President Biden has put forward credible proposals for dealing with the costs that really impact American families, and I'm hopeful that we in Congress will take him up on it and take concrete bipartisan action to make the lives of average Americans easier and better in the year ahead.
Last thing, Senator, I want to ask you about the point that Senator Thune made there at the end, that in his view and the view of many Republicans, the president had adopted an agenda last year that was off on the wrong track. He called it a left-wing agenda. He said now the president has an opportunity for a reset. How do you see that?
Well, I see his first year as one in which, yes, there was one bill, for example, at the first part of the year that was passed with Democrats only, the American Rescue Plan, which was vital to reopening schools and businesses and supporting state and local governments and public health. It's too bad that that got no Republican support. I didn't think it was a left-wing bill at all. But his crowning achievement of the second half of the year was a strongly bipartisan bill on infrastructure. So frankly, I don't think President Biden has governed as a left-wing president as much as he has governed as a pragmatic president trying to solve the very real challenges facing us, from climate change to health care to this pandemic. I do think that he will lay out a unity agenda near the end of his State of the Union address tonight. I'll remind you, President Biden believes in the American people. He's optimistic, and he still believes that if we come together, there's no problem that we can't solve together.
Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Judy.
And we'll be back shortly with more coverage of President Biden's State of the Union. But first, take a moment to hear from your local PBS station. It's a chance to offer your support, which helps to keep programs like ours on the air. For those stations staying with us, we revisit a renowned dancer and choreographer who is interpreting and who we are as a society and as a nation. Jeffrey Brown visits with Bill T. Jones for our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
One man, Bill T. Jones, roams an enormous space, telling a story of himself and his country.
Brutality, police, horrors unspeakable.
He's joined by a small group of dancers who enact and move through that story. And then by some 90 others, members of the larger community, filling the space, moving as a crowd.
I know to be black is to be beautiful.
Adding their own stories as individuals. It's called Deep Blue Sea.
The piece is about pursuit of the we.
Pursuit of the we.
Of the we. It's thrown around all the time. We the people. We shall overcome. Politicians use it all the time. This we. Who is this we that you're talking about, considering how fractious our country is and how it has been from the beginning.
Jones has used dance to ask big questions of himself and others since the 1980s, when he and his partner in life and dance, Arnie Zane, first formed a company. Even as their fame grew, their world was devastated by AIDS, which would take the life of Zane in 1988 and so many others. Jones would go on to create more than 150 dances. Early on, D-Man in the Waters, which directly addressed the loss of his loved ones. It's now the subject of a new documentary titled Can You Bring It?, co-directed by Rosalind LeBlanc, one of Jones' former dancers. And he's continued to take on big subjects in American life and history, as in a 2009 work on Lincoln. His choreography on Broadway for Spring Awakening and Fela garnered 2 Tony Awards. Last spring, amid the pandemic, he premiered Afterwardsness in the vastness of New York's Park Avenue Armory, a dance of distance and loneliness capturing our moment.
They don't remember. We just don't remember.
Now 69, he returned to the Armory with Deep Blue Sea, a monologue with movement and projection that transforms the space into the sea itself. In it, he recalls reading Moby Dick in school.
I don't remember Pip.
And years later, realizing he'd forgotten the young African-American character, the cabin boy Pip, who loses his mind at sea.
Now Pip gets so frightened that he jumps into the water.
Jones saw parallels to today's loss of young black lives.
Was it Trayvon Martin or was it Michael Brown in Ferguson? Those things began to happen so regularly. And as we know in American society, they've never stopped happening, but they suddenly became mediatized. And I was putting together my strong reactions to that with the fact that I had not seen this small little character who was in a way kind of collateral damage on Ahab's ship.
When I was 16, 15, 16, 17 years old.
Another character here, Bill T. Jones himself, 10th of 12 children whose parents were migrant farm workers, first in Florida, then New York State.
The young boy that I was when I read the book actually felt the world was full of possibility. I don't know if my mother and father felt that, but I did. And that's what they wanted for me. They wanted a world that was full of possibility. Now, this piece is asking what happened to that young boy in me, and how are they doing in you as well?
But do you want us to see those depths and those revelations as comments on American history, America where we are today?
I want them to resound with you. Are you a moral person? Do you give a damn? I want to believe, as Dr. King believed, that you're basically fair and kind.
The life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination.
Martin Luther King Jr. is another touchstone here, another way to question where we and our country are today.
Art making is resistance. I don't know if we're the most responsible people for managing a city or a hospital or a TV station, but you need us there because we're willing to actually ask the questions and look for answers in unexpected directions.
Inevitably here too, the pandemic. The audience was required to be vaccinated and masked. But for Jones, again, the issues go deeper.
My question, is there a we, seems almost banal now. Considering COVID had showed us very clearly, oh yes, there is a we. Not in the high-minded and positive way that you're looking at, but we are heir to literally microbes. We are heir to the vicissitudes of health and politics that we can barely name.
I have seen you describe the pandemic as your second play. What did you learn that applies now or makes you think about making art now?
Well, I guess being the son of a Southern Baptist woman, even though I'm an atheist, I do believe there is an over level of consciousness. Art can do that. It might not take away all the people's pain, but it might do something else which is just as good, give people a context in which they can endure. That's it. Can you make something that invites people in to have a shared experience and keep living? That's it. Can you encourage people to keep living?
Bill T. Jones retired as a dancer 15 years ago. He's back performing now, he says, because this work required his full commitment, and he wanted to gather and help lead this larger community. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown at the Park Avenue Armory in New York.
Our live special coverage of the State of the Union will begin shortly here on PBS. To give us a sense of what's happening now on Capitol Hill, Lisa Desjardins is back. Lisa, the president will address the Congress and the nation just after 9 p.m. Eastern. You're talking to members. What are they saying?
You know, Judy, there is over this Congress building right now a seriousness, a rising concern about world events and some in this country. But I have to tell you, this speech in particular, it is unusual for the pandemic. Things are calm. Even though every member of Congress will be in the chamber, everyone had to pick up a ticket. You had to get a COVID test and test negative. People will be unmasked for the first time in this building in, I think, about a year. Overall, it's a sense maybe things are a little bit normal, not electric, but normal going into this speech.
Wouldn't that be something? Getting back to normal. Lisa Desjardins, and we'll be looking for your coverage throughout the evening. And that's the NewsHour for tonight, but don't go anywhere. Our coverage of Ukraine and President Biden's State of the Union address continues online right now at pbs.org/newshour and here on PBS beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 Central. I'm Judy Woodruff. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you. Please stay safe, and we'll see you again shortly.
Major funding for the PBS.
Joe Biden is heading to Capitol Hill to deliver his first State of the Union address. In tonight's special coverage, we'll tackle the big topics and questions on the minds of Americans 1 year into Biden's presidency. He came into office pledging pandemic relief for millions, historic infrastructure spending, curbs on climate change, and protection for voting rights. But the past year has been filled with hurdles and headaches for the administration. A chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, and now the Russian invasion of Ukraine overseas, and at home, stalled legislation in Congress, and an increasingly divided country struggling to cope with inflation and a pandemic. So, what will the president's message be to Americans tonight? As his approval ratings slump, can he lay out a vision that Congress and the country will get behind? I spoke with NewsHour's Lisa Desjardins about the importance of political messaging in tonight's speech and the historical context of the State of the Union.
Lisa, you've covered a lot of speeches like this and looked at how presidents in the past have used it as a platform. What's the significance of this tradition?
That is such a wonderful question. This goes all the way back to the very foundations of this country. And when America was first set up, it wasn't clear how the president would communicate with the country. There had not been any kind of position like that. Usually kings issued dictates, decrees. But here was a president who was, in fact, beholden to the American people and to Congress itself. So, as you know, Congress, the president is required to, from time to time, address the nation and let Congress know his or her goals. And that tradition became the annual State of the Union address. It has become, in the modern age of politics and in the television era, honestly, a very important moment for presidents to try and signal who they are and also to try and both firm up support with their own voters and win over voters from the other party. It at times has been a chance for presidents to try and galvanize morale in this country, to try and push this country toward greater goals like the space race, or even to help the country through things like World War II. But in the modern era, it has been more political, and we have honestly seen fewer of the lofty goals announced in State of the Unions become reality. That used to be the case, but now it has become a speech that is more idealistic and political than it had been before.
At a time where galvanizing people is really hard, what does this moment mean for Biden?
This is a critical moment. not just the speech, but this time frame right now, this next month, the next 2 months of his presidency, you cannot overstate how important they are. This is a president who was elected by a majority of the American people, but not a very large majority. And we have seen since he became president, especially beginning last summer, his approval ratings have dropped. He is now actually has a serious approval rating problem, not just in general, but on what was one of his best issues, the economy. Americans no longer trust him, according to our latest Marist poll. A majority of Americans disapprove of the job he is doing on the economy. We also know that even though there are many issues facing the world and America right now, including Ukraine, that it is the economy and it is a series of domestic issues that is most on American voters' minds. And this president was elected to unify the country, kind of push an exhausted country, a country exhausted by politics, past that and to start getting things done. The American people don't seem to feel that he is getting the things done that they need. So it's a critical moment for him to show that he understands what the American people's concerns are and that he actually can get back on a path toward healing.
He is just over a year into a presidency that is filled with domestic and international issues. What do you think he's going to focus on in this speech?
The White House has been careful not to preview this address too much. On Friday, for example, Press Secretary Jen Psaki said, I'm not going to preview an address that's 4 days away at that time during a developing war. So I think that the White House has been careful to not give us too much. And I think, honestly, I believe the White House is still kind of balancing all of these goals itself. I do think we should look for some important domestic priorities, some things that some of the Democrats in Congress really want him to talk about because they believe that their jobs are on the line, things perhaps like prescription drug prices, things that are popular across the board. I think we should absolutely expect him to spend some time talking about the items, the significant bills that were passed under him so far, the American Rescue Plan, billions of dollars going out under that act now across the country, counties spending that money, and of course the Infrastructure Act. That is something he will tout all of the gains from. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some guests or some acknowledgments to very specific bridges, specific stories of where that money has gone.
Biden's agenda hit a lot of roadblocks this year, including Build Back Better and programs like universal pre-K and expanding healthcare. Why is he having so much trouble getting things done?
First, I like the use of the word roadblock. Good transition from the infrastructure bill into the problems that he's having, the agenda items that are not going very far. You know, you could get into kind of all kind of complex, big picture reasons why these are hitting those roadblocks. But the truth is there are two U.S. senators that are the main problems. It's Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. They personally blocked the idea of Build Back Better as it was forming in the Senate, because as many folks watching will know, you usually need 60 votes in the Senate. Democrats have exactly 50 right now. Joe Biden simply felt the Build Back Better bill was too large. Kyrsten Sinema had problems with the way it dealt with taxes. And I have been amazed that there has been no pulse, no heartbeat for any of these ideas, which so many Democrats believe are foundational to why they came to Congress, to Washington last year. I think it was just such a gut punch to them when Senator Manchin in particular ended the Build Back Better talks last year, that they haven't recovered. And President Biden hasn't made the decision really which of those priorities he wants to or feels he could successfully push for. We are still waiting to figure that out. Meanwhile, now, of course, the White House has other problems, international problems that will also make it more difficult to just get the time on the calendar in Congress to pass any of these big items.
It also, sort of reveals that the fact that two senators can have such an impact is that this is a very partisan Congress and very partisan moment in American history. With that in mind, how do you think Democrats and Republicans are going to respond to Biden's remarks?
I think that it will be a mixed review. I believe we will see the classic, many Democrats coming out saying, what a great president, we've done so much. Many Republicans coming out and saying, this is failed leadership, this is a mistake, that's a mistake. I'm more interested to find those middle ground voices who might be able to say, I disagree with that, I agree with something else. Sad to say, though, I think they will be few. I think we will get predictable responses depending on the party that you identify with.
The NewsHour's most recent poll with Marist and NPR found that 58% of Americans disapprove of how Biden is handling the economy right now. How do you think Biden will address that tonight?
Right. I think that is that really troubling number for him. I think we are going to hear him probably try to thread a difficult needle here. Last week, we heard him try to manage these expectations, especially with regard to the upheaval in Ukraine. And he told Americans, yes, we may see some pain from this, and we may see pain from this at the pump. He wants Americans to be prepared for gas prices potentially to keep going up. And he said, and I think he will say again in the State of the Union, that we are doing this for a reason. We are supporting Ukraine for an important reason. It is about our values. It is about freedom. He has to convince Americans that that price they're personally feeling is worth it in the sense of American values. I expect to hear that. But at the same time, as he will acknowledge that there are economic issues in this country right now, I suspect he will also try to lay the case that they've been overblown and to try and say that he will probably talk a lot about all of the gains since the coronavirus hit, everything his administration has done in terms of job growth, where those job growths have hit.
Some Democrats have criticized President Biden for not delivering on campaign promises. What are some of the issues voters who voted for him are going to want to hear him address or deal with that they haven't really felt have been fulfilled yet?
Oh, boy, that's a long list, but it's a right question. I think one of those issues that is not getting enough attention mainstream, but which many of the president's supporters still care about and are still very concerned about, is sort of police reform, racial justice, especially in the justice system. The talks to try and pass federal police reform broke down last year. There really have been no serious efforts at trying to revive them. This was due to Republican and Democratic impasse. But I wonder if President Biden will speak to that. That is something that I think is very core for many of his voters.
Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa.
Oh, what a pleasure.
Biden made history by selecting Ketanji Brown Jackson as his Supreme Court nominee. And he fulfilled a campaign promise to select a Black woman for the bench. The two celebrated this highly anticipated and historic announcement at the White House Friday.
Today, as we watch freedom and liberty under attack abroad, I'm here to fulfill my responsibilities under the Constitution to preserve freedom and liberty here in the United States of America. And it's my honor to introduce to the country a daughter of former public school teachers, a proven consensus builder, an accomplished lawyer, a distinguished jurist, one of the nation's most prestigious courts. My nominee for the United States Supreme Court is Judge Ketanji Jackson.
If I am fortunate enough to be confirmed as the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, I can only hope that my life and career, my love of this country and the Constitution, and my commitment to upholding the rule of law and the sacred principles upon which this great nation was founded will inspire future generations of Americans.
But before his announcement, most people didn't know much about her. This profile by NewsHour's Jeff Bennett takes a deeper look at her life and career as a federal court judge.
I'm even-handedly applying the law in every case.
Ketanji Brown Jackson has a resume seemingly tailor-fit for the moment. Harvard grad, Supreme Court clerk, and a federal judge with a deep history in public service.
There is a direct line from my defender service to what I do on the bench.
D.C. born and Miami raised, Jackson stood out early, excelling in high school as class president and on the debate team. Even then, her goal was clear. She's quoted in her senior yearbook saying, "I want to go into law and eventually have a judicial appointment." Her teenage years were key to achieving that, as she put it in 2017.
It was my high school experience as a competitive speaker that taught me how to lean in despite the obstacles.
With honors degrees from Harvard and Harvard Law, Jackson scored 3 federal clerkships, including one under the justice she may now replace.
Justice Breyer plucked me from obscurity and gave me the opportunity of a lifetime.
And I will say she is adored among the Breyer clerk family.
She made a lasting impression, said fellow Breyer clerk and former acting U.S. Solicitor General Neil Katyal.
She's fearless, and also she's a real person. And sometimes that's not always true with Supreme Court justices who live in an elite, rarefied atmosphere. But she's a judge who's never forgotten the human side of judging.
She's seen that human side up close, with family on both sides of the justice system. Her brother working for the Baltimore Police Department, and her uncle serving a life sentence for a cocaine conviction.
Justice demands this result.
She worked to understand and improve the system as a public defender and as vice chair of the U.S. Sentencing Commission.
That is an unusual addition and I think a valuable perspective.
Margaret Russell is a constitutional law professor who says Jackson's criminal defense background sets her apart.
There are many former prosecutors who are already on the bench. But what's interesting about a public defender, and really quite rare on the court, it's been a couple of decades, is that focus on the indigent defendant, someone who is really lacking an opportunity, often despised, often overlooked.
On the Sentencing Commission, Jackson continued that work, fighting for more equitable drug penalties.
There is no federal sentencing provision that is more closely identified with unwarranted disparity and perceived systemic unfairness than the 100-to-1 crack powder penalty distinction.
That was the first of 3 Senate confirmations for Jackson. In 2012, she was nominated to the federal bench in Washington, D.C., introduced by then Congressman Paul Ryan, who's related to Jackson by marriage.
But my praise for Ketanji's intellect, for her character, for her integrity, it's unequivocal. She's an amazing person.
She earned a reputation on the district court for being thorough and methodical.
You can tell she has that speech and debate background because she likes to engage with the parties.
Sanchi Kare and Neha Sabharwal clerked for Jackson and say they were struck by her work ethic.
One thing that she would tell us when I was clerking for her is that, you can't always expect to be the smartest person in the room, but you can promise to be the hardest working. And she truly lives by that philosophy.
And by the warm welcome she extended.
And she came out of her office, huge smile, gave me a huge hug, and told me how excited she was that I would be working for her. And that sort of set the tone for the rest of my clerkship experience.
A memory that I had, that I still have of her, is this relay race in which several DC Circuit and DDC chambers participated. And at the judge's suggestion, we made matching t-shirts and set up a training schedule and lined up everyone in chambers to participate, because she just has so much spirit for everything that she does, and her diligence is really contagious.
It was there on the district court that Jackson sentenced more than 100 people and penned some of her best-known opinions. In 2017, she presided over the so-called Pizzagate conspiracy case, delivering a 4-year prison sentence for a man who fired his gun in a D.C. pizza shop, wrongly believing it was home to a child sex ring. And in 2019, she ordered that former Trump White House counsel Don McGahn comply with a congressional subpoena during the Russia investigation. Siding against the Trump administration, she plainly wrote, "Presidents are not kings."
One thing is clear. The 120-page ruling had a purpose.
It came up at her 3rd Senate appearance, this one for the D.C. Court of Appeals, seen as a tryout for a Supreme Court hearing.
I am both humbled and very grateful to be here once again.
Republicans took aim at Jackson's public defender clients.
Have you ever represented a terrorist at Guantanamo Bay?
About 16 years ago, when I was a federal public defender.
And her identity.
What role does race play, Judge Jackson, in the kind of judge that you have been and the kind of judge you will be?
I don't think that race plays a role in the kind of judge that I have been and that I would be.
Behind her at those hearings, her husband, Dr. Patrick Jackson, and one of their 2 daughters. The pair met in college and were, as she says, an unlikely match at first.
He and his twin brother are, in fact, 6th generation Harvard. By contrast, I am only the 2nd generation in my family to go to any college, and I'm fairly certain that if you traced my family back past my grandparents, who were raised in Georgia, by the way, you would find that my ancestors were slaves on both sides.
The yeas are 53, the nays are 44. The nomination is confirmed.
She was ultimately confirmed with 53 votes, all 50 Democrats, plus Republican senators Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and Lindsey Graham. That put Jackson, now 51 years old, in the seat formerly held by another Supreme Court hopeful.
Today I am nominating Chief Judge Merrick Brian Garland to join the Supreme Court.
Before then President Obama made that decision in 2016, Jackson's 11-year-old daughter wrote in with her own suggestion.
Dear Mr. President, while you are considering judges to fill Justice Scalia's seat on the Supreme Court, I would like to add my mother, Ketanji Brown Jackson of the District Court, to the list.
Her opinions are always carefully
6 years
reasoned,
later, it's President Biden honoring that request. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeff Bennett.
Selecting Jackson is a landmark moment for the legal field and the American justice system, especially for Black women, who make up less than 2% of the federal bench. For more on the historical significance and how Judge Jackson could reshape the nation's highest court, my colleague Lisa Desjardins spoke with law professor Margaret Russell and the National Law Journal's Marcia Coyle.
Marcia, let me start with you. What do you think this means? How would Judge Jackson fit in with or maybe change this current court?
Well, I think, Lisa, first we have to realize that she will not change the ideological divide on the court. It will still be a 6-3 conservative majority. But that doesn't mean she can't be influential in several ways. First of all, she is the only one on the court who has been a federal public defender. She's seen a side of the criminal justice system that none of the other justices have experienced. So when they go into their private conferences, she can bring that to the table if the case before them is relevant. It not only is her experience, but she can share that experience with the others and perhaps influence what they decide in some way. The other way she can have influence is she's only the 2nd justice on the current court to have been a trial judge. Justice Sotomayor is the only other one. And believe me, they bring a unique perspective as well to the court. They know how trials operate. They know what lawyers do in those trials. And the court often has cases about trial practices and what lawyers do or don't do during those trials. And finally, I think her dissents can become majority opinions, and also they can be influential in lower courts as they try to decide cases and perhaps move cases up to the Supreme Court. So I think she brings all those qualities and life experiences to bear when she sits on the Supreme Court if she is confirmed.
Margaret Russell, this is a historic nomination, as the president and others, everyone points out. What does this mean to you, but also what do you think this means for the Supreme Court?
This is a tremendously historic and significant day, not just for me, but I see it as in the history of this nation, in the history of the Supreme Court. For African-American women in the legal profession, it has been a long uphill battle. That is also true of other groups. But the significance of Judge Jackson's ascendancy to a court that, when it first sat in 1790, had all white men, of course, 6 white men, and did not have a Black member of the court until the 1960s and a female member of the court until the 1980s, should really be cause for reflection, not just sort of a recitative regurgitation of facts. But what it means is that there is a history of exclusion in the legal profession and a history of exclusion among the people who actually decide the fate of millions and billions of Americans, including African Americans. So I think it's extremely significant.
Of course, even before we knew who the nominee was to be, Republicans criticized how the president went about this. They criticized that he was pledging to nominate a black woman as something that they said was not substantive and smacked of a quota system. I wonder what you make of that.
Well, I would say that in talking about it, it's important to remember that there were no black members of the court until the late 1960s with Thurgood Marshall, and there were no female members. So criticizing Biden for making a point about race doesn't mean that all of those other decisions did not involve racial identity. They did, racial identity and gender identity. I hope that it's seen as a step forward for the nation, not just based on political party, because what it means is that President Biden, who had previously been chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee and is a lawyer himself, knows his facts. It meant that when he made that promise, he knew that there was already a pool of talent that could yield exceptionally well-qualified people to be on the United States Supreme Court. Second, when he became president, he made sure that there was an ample pool on the federal bench, and beginning with the district court and then with the Court of Appeals, so that no one could say that it was non-substantive. It is a substantive decision to recognize that African-American women in the legal profession have grown enormously.
Marcia, now that we know Judge Jackson is the nominee, we also are getting an idea of maybe some Republican criticism ahead. This from Senator McConnell today, the Republican leader of the Senate. He said Jackson is the choice of far-left dark money groups. Now that's political, of course, not substantive. We're talking about what's substantive, what's not. Marcia, this comes after two very tense and political Supreme Court nomination fights. Just to wrap up this, can you help us with what you think is ahead in this process? What dynamics do you see?
Well, it's almost the flip side of, what we saw with the last couple of Republican nominations. Certainly Democrats accused Republican nominees of being supported by dark money groups. But try to stay focused on Judge Jackson and what may be ahead. She was confirmed in June by the U.S. Senate, and she had 3 Republican supports. And it's true that a confirmation to a federal appellate court is different than a confirmation to the U.S. Supreme Court. But there really wasn't a whole lot to try to block her with when she went before the Senate in June. And she has been confirmed 3 times by the U.S. Senate, Sentencing Commission, Federal District Court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. And so far, there has been nothing major to stop her from moving forward. So I guess what I'm saying is we're just going to have to wait and see how this, I think it was Senator Arlen Specter who called it a kabuki dance, actually plays out in the next couple of weeks.
That's right. Next few weeks, Democrats hoping to get this nomination through by the first weeks of April. Marcia Coyle and Margaret Russell, thank you both very much.
Always a pleasure, Lisa.
When President Biden steps up to the House floor podium tonight, he'll be addressing an American public that is largely dissatisfied with his presidency so far. The latest PBS NewsHour NPR Marist poll found that more than half of Americans viewed his first year as president as a failure. To discuss how the public sees President Biden right now, I spoke with the NewsHour's coordinating producer for polling, Laura Santanam.
Laura, this poll asked people what they want Biden's top priority to be. How did they respond, and what does that tell us?
Right now, 38% of U.S. adults say they think that inflation needs to be President Joe Biden's top priority. And that was the most important thing about that we heard from half of Republicans and independents. But Biden has a long to-do list that the American people want to hear him talk about tonight, in addition to their economic concerns. In the PBS NewsHour's latest poll with NPR and Marist, 11% of adults said they think that the pandemic should be Biden's top agenda item. And another 11% of Americans say they think that Biden needs to be taking action right now on voting laws. So there's a lot there that's really top of mind for people.
The poll also tells us that the country is split on whether or not Biden is delivering on campaign promises. Has that always been the case?
That's exactly right. People are not satisfied with his ability to do what he said he was going to do, but it hasn't always been that way. Right now, 54% of Americans say they don't think President Joe Biden is following through on what he said he was going to do when he was campaigning to be president. And that's relatively unchanged since November. But this trend also marks a big loss in faith since last April, when 35% of people said that they don't think he's doing what he said he was going to do. A lot's changed since then. There's been the Delta variant, Omicron variant, creating surges in breakthrough cases after a big rollout in vaccines. There have also been hiccups in getting vaccines to younger kids. And then, there have been several other, supply chain issues with the economy, U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, a lot of big hurdles for his White House. And it's also important to think of who's losing faith in him. Younger voters are really shaken by what they're seeing from his administration right now. 59% of Gen Z and millennials say they don't think he's doing what he told them he was going to do. And that's compared to 49% of baby boomers. So he's really got an uphill slog ahead of him.
There's also this contrast between how people are faring in the pandemic at this point and how they feel about the Biden administration's leadership in terms of policies. Why is that?
It's a great question. Right now, 72% of Americans say that they approve of where things are going. They feel good about where things are going, that, they think the U.S. is nearing the end of the pandemic. But at the same time, the country's really divided on how they feel about how Joe Biden is handling the pandemic, how he's managing the situation. 47% of people say that they approve of the job he's doing, while another 49% say they don't. And that's just a sign of how shaken people are right now and how divided the country is on this subject.
Biden's ability to get things done also depends on Congress. How have people's views of Congress and what they do changed?
It's a great question. Right now, roughly 2/3 of Americans say they think that, policymakers should find compromise to get to the solutions that the country needs in order to get back on track. But that's a far cry from what we saw in 2012, right? When 72% of Americans said that they think it's most important for lawmakers to compromise with each other, to work with each other, reach across the aisle. But at the same time, and over the course of the last decade, really, we've seen a inching up of people who say they prefer gridlock to compromise. Right now, 29% of Americans say that they think, it's more important for lawmakers, government officials to, stand on principle, even if that means not getting anything done. And that's up from 24%, over the course of the last decade. So, it's a sign that, just these divisive politics that we keep talking about are influencing the way people see, the way that they value what lawmakers should be doing for them and for everyone.
Was there anything surprising about the findings in this poll?
I guess, one thing that really struck me was just, how much of an uphill climb Biden and his administration has right now with the American people after 1 year. When I spoke with economist Austin Goolsbee, who was part of the Obama administration during the recession, he told me that the first year of a president's time in office is going to be the most fun that he has. And then after that, it's really just a long slog. So, when I heard that and looking at these numbers, it really struck me how much work the Biden administration has ahead of them.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you.
The COVID-19 pandemic is one of the biggest issues facing Americans and the Biden administration. According to the latest PBS NewsHour NPR Marist poll, Americans are divided over the administration's leadership during the pandemic. 47% said they approve of what the White House has done so far, but 49% said they disapprove. Regardless of personal opinion, the fact still remains that there have been more than 78 million COVID cases in the U.S., and we're very close to 1 million deaths. I spoke with NewsHour correspondent William Brigham about the Biden administration's approach to COVID and how their response has been perceived so far.
The administration was handed a terrible pandemic, and no administration wants to come in and do that. And as you mentioned, Nicole, 1 million deaths, getting close to 1 million Americans that have lost their lives is really unfathomable. As far as what the administration has done, it has, as this principal effort, ramped up the vaccination campaign. I mean, the Trump administration established these vaccines, which are truly miraculous, life-saving, and largely effective against this virus, even the new strains. So they set up mobile mobile vaccination clinics. They really tried to get that education campaign out, but we still lag behind a lot of peer nations in our ability to vaccinate everybody. On the testing front, that has been a major problem. We can talk about that more later, but that has been a major problem of getting rapid tests out there so that they can actually be useful in helping stop the spread. And there's also been an ongoing criticism of the messaging about this pandemic. It has at times been confusing and sometimes contradictory, and that's allowed critics to seize on things and say, aha, you see, you weren't telling us the truth about masks, or you weren't telling us the truth about vaccines. You know, the sympathetic argument to that is that science is a very difficult thing to communicate. This virus is ever evolving, and that is a very difficult thing to stay on top of. And every time you change because your opponent changes, that's not a sign of being untruthful. That's just a sign of how a pandemic works. So it's a mixed record. The Biden administration would say that they have done everything humanly possible to curtail this virus, but the coronavirus keeps throwing new curveballs at us.
Biden came into office vowing to expand testing, but that Omicron surge revealed that it was still nowhere near where it needed to be. So what has the Biden administration done to expand testing?
Yes, this has really been sort of one of the original sins of this pandemic. From the Trump administration, even through the Biden administration, our failure to do a better job of getting testing out there has been a huge problem, and it has really hampered our ability to respond. The Biden administration came in and they quickly tried to expand mobile testing sites. They set big clinics up. They tried to work in partnerships with drugstores and grocery stores to try to make testing more readily available. And those PCR tests, that's where you got those, are great. But the results for those were often very slow. And so if you took a test and then didn't get results for 4, 5, 6 days, sometimes even more, that does you almost no good in trying to know whether or not you're contagious at this moment. That's what rapid tests are for. And as we have seen, the deployment of rapid tests has come very, very late. And that is still a big sore spot for this administration and a subject of much criticism, that the failure to recognize that we needed more rapid tests, hundreds of millions of them everywhere in the country, and we didn't get that until relatively recently, has been a huge problem.
You know, to put the impact of Omicron in perspective, that variant went from less than 1% of cases in the U.S. to just over 70 in 2 weeks this winter. How did the administration handle the Omicron variant?
Yeah, Omicron really surprised so many people in its incredible contagiousness. I mean, this thing took off, as you described, like a wildfire through dry grass, and it caught many people by surprise. I mean, viruses do this sometimes. They mutate in different ways. And the initial studies that came out showed that while it was more contagious, it was less virulent, meaning it made you less sick. But it had the ability, because it was so hyper contagious, at seeking out the large unvaccinated population in America. So even though, generally speaking, it's a milder form of the coronavirus, it was able to reach all those unvaccinated people in the U.S. who had thus far escaped infection, and it made those people sick, and it sent a lot of those people to the hospital, and it killed a lot of those people. And so even though it's considered milder, that has been a huge sort of vulnerability, that our inability to vaccinate more people in this country, Omicron really exacerbated that. And this has been the problem that the administration has been facing, that they've been trying to get vaccination rates up. They hoped that Omicron and its spread would help that effort, but that effort has largely plateaued.
There's also that nuance of vaccinated people getting the Omicron variant and how that impacted the administration's response or the awareness that the Omicron variant existed and was likely on its way. How did the administration respond in terms of how to address what became, a wildfire in dry grass.
No, that's exactly right. When we started, we'll remember in the early days of the vaccination campaign, a so-called breakthrough infection, someone who had been fully vaccinated, back then it was just 2 shots, those people very, very rarely got infected. But Omicron showed that it had the ability to slide a little bit past those vaccine protections, and that only sort of stirred a lot of additional misinformation about the vaccines, because the critics would say, well, you could see now the vaccines are not working. Omicron is proving that. It's not true at all. Omicron is still largely defeated by the vaccines. There are occasional breakthrough cases, but it really does protect you from getting sick and certainly from dying. But that has allowed a certain doubt to creep out there, and people who are prone to hearing a lot of misinformation and skepticism about the vaccines, Omicron has really exploited that and made that problem worse as well.
Is there any indication that the administration will handle variants differently in the future?
It's hard to know. I mean, there is a new strain that has come out now. It is a relative of Omicron. It's called BA2. It's spread quite wildly in about 43 different countries. It's here in the US. It's only about 4% of cases right now. It does, if you can believe this, does seem to be more contagious than even Omicron, which itself was remarkably contagious. So we're looking at that. As far as what the administration can or cannot do in this regard, I think we are at this point, and many public health officials would concur, that people are so tired of all of this masking, distancing, school closures, vaccination campaigns, that even if there were a new strain that really did take off and started to send more people to the hospital, and these plummeting Omicron rates started to go back up again, there's no evidence that's happening yet. But if that were to happen, are we as a society able to reimpose some of those protections to try to blunt a future wave? That's still, I think, a real open question. My sense is, and from public experts I've talked to, public health experts, is that the administration would again emphasize vaccination, boosting, masking, staying out of crowded social places. But that's a very hard message now, 2+ years into this pandemic, to sell to people.
When it comes to COVID and this pandemic, what do you think Biden is going to hit on in terms of key points?
I think the president will echo what he has echoed all along, which is these vaccines are proven to be life-saving, miraculous drugs. They're free of charge, and he'll urge every American to go out and get them. He's been doing that since he was on the campaign trail and since he entered the White House. That has been his message from day one. There are lots of reasons why people are not getting vaccinated. Some of them have to do with their ability to simply take the time off, or their job, or whether they have health insurance, or whether they've been fed a diet of misinformation. So I think he'll try to counter all of that. I think the president will also address the fact that we are 2 years into this and approaching, as you mentioned, perhaps 1 million people who have died from this pandemic, and that this is still a tragedy that is not behind us. We like to think that Omicron and that wave is really subsiding, and it is, but there are still thousands of Americans that are dying every single day. I would be surprised if the president didn't try to reflect on that point as well.
What are the things we're not going to hear Biden talk about tonight? What are the numbers or issues that he may shy away from when it comes to COVID?
One thing that I think is a sensitive topic for the administration is the enormous gap in what's called global vaccine equity, meaning the wealthiest nations on the planet gobbled up the original bulk of all the vaccines available, and poorer nations did not. So while some wealthy nations have gotten near 90% of their population vaccinated, there are many, many countries where the percentage is 10, 11%. I read recently that healthcare workers in the entire continent of Africa, only 25% of them have been vaccinated. This is a glaring issue. And the administration would argue it has put more, perhaps, than any other nation into the global vaccine effort to try to remedy that. But it is still a huge inequity in the world. And this is why we get variants, because the virus remains unchecked largely in many nations. And so from a purely fairness basis, we need to be doing a better job of getting vaccines to all the countries that need them.
Thank you, William.
My pleasure, Nicole.
In addition to problem solving at home, every president has to navigate foreign policy and rifts among allies and adversaries. I spoke with Nancy Youssef, a national security correspondent at the Wall Street Journal, about the foreign policy challenges on President Biden's plate. We started with the crisis in Ukraine.
Ukraine is hands down the biggest foreign policy issue President Biden is dealing with right now. How is the administration handling messaging around that?
Well, it's an interesting time because the administration had said from the beginning, the president himself kept referring to the fact that the idea of democracy itself was under threat. That was one of his early messages of his presidency. And now we're seeing it less than a year later play out in very real terms on the streets of Ukraine. And so the messaging from this administration has been that this, rather than breaking the European alliance and breaking NATO, as I think Vladimir Putin had hoped, that this would become a unifying message. And that was really reinforced, I think, by Germany's decision to send defensive weapons to the Ukrainians, something that was sort of unimaginable just a few weeks ago. I think the challenge will be, particularly in the State of the Union, is going forward. One way that the U.S. might have to find itself supporting Ukraine is to look at things like energy supplies. And we could see a situation where everyday Americans are really feeling the impact of the U.S. push to hold Russia accountable for its actions in Ukraine. And so I think one of the things you'll hear in the State of the Union is this is about defending democracy. This is about backing allies. And part of that might demand Americans, even after a pandemic, even after rising costs, to maybe pay more at the pump going forward, to really put a stop to what is not just a threat to Europe, but to the idea of democracy itself.
This is also a very public-facing war where social media allows us to see everything that's happening in real time. How does that affect the public's opinion of Biden's response?
Well, what's interesting is not only do we get to see what's happening, but we also get to see what's not happening, because there's also a disinformation campaign that's going on alongside the very graphic and sometimes poignant images we're seeing from Ukraine. And so I think it creates a level of urgency that perhaps past conflicts didn't have, and also a sense of intimacy because people are experiencing this war on their phones, on their computers. And so I think it's increased the pressure for the administration to help the Ukrainians. But I also think it's become one reason we've seen protests around the country in support of Ukrainians, because this is a war that in a way has become personal for many Americans as they're experiencing it in real time. You know, the bombardments we're seeing and the attacks in Kiev, they're happening at night, U.S. time, and you can feel Americans sort of watching this night by night, wondering, will Kiev hold on another day? Will President Zelensky, who's become such a public face of the Ukrainian resistance, will his administration be able to survive? This is a war that has a face and images behind it, and they're impactful ones to everyday Americans, even those who maybe didn't even know about some of the dynamics that Ukraine was facing just a few weeks ago.
I want to pivot to Afghanistan now. Afghanistan was America's longest war. Many foreign policy watchers were expecting Biden to leverage his experience for a smoother exit strategy. What are some of the successes and failures of how the administration handled Afghanistan?
Well, I think up until Ukraine, Afghanistan was believed to be the premier foreign policy subject that the president would have to speak to in the State of the Union. I think for a lot of Americans, the way the war ended was an outward display of the loss of America's sort of imperialism and abilities to really be the world superpower militarily, because I think it was such a shocking visually, the U.S. withdrawal, the idea of Afghans holding on to the planes and the desperate search to get out of the country are images that will stay with the presidency for the length of it. And so I think going into the State of the Union, I think we'll hear a President Biden who will talk less about how the war ended and more about why the war ended, in a bid to sort of say, while it didn't go to plan, it was necessary for the U.S.'s long-term interests to end that war, that another 5, 10, 15 years wasn't going to fundamentally change the outcome in Afghanistan. And the proof of it was how quickly it collapsed.
So, that gives us a great sense of how Biden may frame how he handled that exit strategy, but how do Americans feel like he handled it?
You know, it's interesting because as someone who's been covering the war since nearly the beginning, that was a war that was largely forgotten until the month of August as the U.S. was leaving. And so I think for Americans, it was shocking because it went from the forgotten war to the defining war in terms of U.S. standing in the international community. And so I think it's something that really resonates and continues to resonate. Remember that President Biden promised two things as a leader in U.S. foreign policy, which was to be compassionate and competent. And I think the way it went down and the fact that the U.S. was so caught by surprise, and the heartbreaking images, and by the way, ending with not only the death of 13 U.S. service members, but a strike that mistakenly killed a family of 10 on the final day of the war, really undercut those arguments that he made about what he was bringing to the job. And I don't think Americans have forgotten about it. The images, the idea of Americans leaving that way, while nobody knew how Afghanistan was going to end, and maybe many thought that it was time for U.S. forces to leave, the how is important for Americans. The administration will focus on the why, but I don't think that resolves for many that question of how America left.
Biden also inherited a strained relationship with China. What's the administration doing to try and repair that?
So I think what we've seen from the Biden administration is a real push to veer away from the Trump administration's approach, to say that this administration is going to look at China in a fundamentally different way. We saw that in the most sort of demonstrative case of the Olympics, in which the U.S. had a diplomatic boycott, saying that it wouldn't send its official delegation in. And we've also seen that in terms of how the U.S. is looking at trade, that the U.S. has promised to be much tougher on China than the Trump administration. But militarily, the U.S. hasn't made as much of a move as it sort of had assumed. There was talk early in this administration about a pivot towards Asia, but Afghanistan, Ukraine, the coronavirus pandemic, the domestic issues that the United States has faced has really made the scale of that shift not as large as I think the administration envisioned when it took office 13 months ago.
It also raises the question of what's the context of some of the setbacks that the administration has faced in, this idea of pivoting to Asia, but really sort of struggling to foster a healthier relationship with China.
Right. And that relationship has actually become key in other areas in Ukraine itself, in terms of how Russia has been reaching out to China, and the U.S.'s inability to really kind of understand that relationship and see if there's room for leveraging that. We heard a lot from American administration officials saying that there was going to be a strong bond between Russia and China. It's not clear that that's happened yet. The inability to fix that, I think, makes it harder to put pressure on Russia from that side. I think there's universal agreement along the international community. I think expanding that to China would be impactful as we think about ways to solve the conflict in China. In Ukraine. And so I think a stronger relationship with China, a better understanding of China, I think would have been valuable as the U.S. tackles Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
What do you think Biden's going to avoid addressing tonight?
Well, I think the biggest thing he will avoid is sort of relitigating Afghanistan and having a discussion about what happened, how it happened, why it happened. I think he will avoid a discussion about deploying the U.S. military around the world as he talks about these conflicts. There's been a real push by this administration to not use the military as much as it has been over the past 2 decades. And I think there'll be less of a discussion of the challenges that we haven't even had a chance to address that continue throughout the world, that there are particularly when it comes to countering extremist groups. We saw, for example, in the Sahel, France has withdrawn its troops. There are worries about the rise of ISIS again, and Al-Qaeda in other parts of the world, and the U.S. hasn't really sought to be in the leader in sort of confronting that. So I think the wars that the U.S. has fought for the past 2 decades will not be discussed as much in the State of the Union for the first time in a long, long time.
Thank you so much for joining us and your insight, Nancy.
Thank you.
Whatever the president says tonight, there's no doubt that politics will drive a lot of his talking points. For more on the political stakes of the speech, Jeff Bennett spoke with PBS NewsHour regulars Amy Walter and Tamara Keith.
In his speech, the president will lay out his domestic agenda, not just to Congress, but to a nation eager to move on from the deadly COVID pandemic, but which is now facing new worries over inflation and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Here to assess what's at stake are Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter and Tamara Keith of NPR. With a welcome to you both. Tam, I'll start with you because President Biden, with his speech tomorrow, is set to deliver what might be the most important presidential foreign policy speech of the post-Cold War era, given the situation in Ukraine, given Putin's apparent desire to redraw the post-Cold War security map of Europe. And President Biden also has to speak directly to the issues that Americans are facing: COVID, record high inflation. How does the White House say he intends to do that?
He is going to address all of those things, and he's going to do it, I think, in a way that is more big picture, more philosophical. That's what these State of the Union addresses are for, is to sort of speak directly to the American people and lay out his vision. You can expect that on COVID. Most of his speeches on COVID recently have, as many as there have been, which isn't very many, have been very tactical. This comes as the mask mandate or the mask recommendation from the CDC has been lifted. As you can expect to see a lot of people in that House chamber not wearing masks tomorrow night, which will be a stark change. He's going to talk about the path forward. On Ukraine, the White House indicates that he is going to emphasize the work that he has done to unite America's allies against Vladimir Putin and against Russia. Uniting the NATO allies, the European Union, that was not a given going into this, and that's a case that the White House says the president will make.
And Amy, on that point, this speech does present an opportunity for the president, given poll after poll showing him with record low approval ratings. This speech is a chance for him, as Tam just said, to point to his leadership, to point to the fact that he has brought together a coalition, an enduring coalition so far, to stand up in the face of Russian aggression.
Well, Jeff, it's interesting. He is coming into this State of the Union address with, you're right, his public opinion polling is the lowest it has been in the course of his presidency. At the same time, though, at least in the early polling we're seeing that's coming out this week at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Americans are actually unified. They're unified in their support for the sanctions that have already taken place on Russia. More Americans now than even earlier in February saying they support the decision of President Biden to send U.S. troops to NATO countries. We're seeing 80+% of Americans saying Vladimir Putin's a bad guy and we don't think he has any, his decision to go into Ukraine has no basis in fact or reality. There's no claim that is truthful that Putin has put forward. So Americans are pretty much united. In fact, what they would like to see, again, these are just the early polls that have come out thus far, they'd like to see actually more sanctions. They'd like to see more aid going to Ukraine. So the challenge for the president right now isn't unifying around support for Ukraine or opposition to Russia's actions. The challenge right now is for Americans to see the president himself as a leader and not just leading on this issue. Again, his polls have been down across all areas, including foreign policy, but especially on the economy. And the NPR PBS Marist poll that was out last week showing the #1 concern for Americans, inflation. That's something he's going to have to talk a lot about because that is the top anxiety right now for the majority of Americans.
And Amy, a quick question about the polling, because when you look at the data, when you look at the numbers, when you look at the way that the questions in these polls are actually framed, are Americans by and large, the folks who are polled, are they really dissatisfied with President Biden's leadership? Or are they, Americans, generally just in a dour mood given this pandemic going into year 3, given inflation, and they're sort of projecting that mood onto the guy in charge?
Well, that's absolutely a big piece of it. Look, we saw the president made his first joint address to Congress about 10 months ago in April, and Americans were feeling much more optimistic then. And the president spent a whole lot of time talking about the success of the vaccines. But now he comes in with vaccines that have been successful, but a public very much divided over mandates, over masking, still frustrated about COVID. But mostly it's new worries, Jeff. This issue of inflation, it wasn't even mentioned in April of 2021. It is now the top concern, rising costs for groceries, for filling up your car, for rent. And the challenge, I think we will soon find out, is whether the president can come back from many Americans who once thought that he was handling the problems that America was facing quite well. Now, even on COVID, opinions of his handling of that has dropped.
And Tam, in the couple of minutes we have left, let's return to the issue we started with, and that was namely Ukraine. And I want to talk about how Republicans are handling this, because Republicans generally have been united in blaming President Biden for his handling of this crisis in Eastern Europe. But former President Donald Trump's comments, I think, have exposed a division here within the GOP. He has repeatedly defended Putin, just a couple of days ago, calling him smart. Take a look at this.
The problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb. Dumb. So dumb.
So, Jeff.
And then you have Republican Senator Mitt Romney saying that Americans who defend Putin are almost treasonous. What do you make of this?
So you could go back, and I did, and you can find Donald Trump saying essentially that very same thing in 2016 and in 2020. He has called Vladimir Putin smart, and he has called the U.S. leadership, NATO, dumb, repeatedly. So he's pretty much consistent with what he's always been. He has, however, upended, his very presence has upended Republican orthodoxy. So now you have some Republicans tying themselves in knots, trying to say, well, I can't condemn what Trump said, but Putin is a bad guy. You have sort of this mess of not knowing what their message is, where in the past it was very clear Republicans and Democrats alike opposed Putin.
Yeah, Tamara Keith and Amy Walter, thanks as always for your great insights.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining this special digital coverage of the 2022 State of the Union. We now turn to Judy Woodruff and PBS NewsHour's broadcast special of the president's speech and the Republican response. I'm Nicole Ellis. Thank you for watching.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to this PBS NewsHour special live coverage of President Biden's State of the Union address. Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff. The president is addressing Congress and the nation 1 year into his time in office, a year that's been punctuated by both achievements and setbacks. 2 years into the pandemic, the number of new COVID-19 cases is dropping, but it has been a long, difficult road as the nation has battled low vaccination rates and a pair of major COVID variants. Under Mr. Biden's leadership, Congress did pass economic stimulus measures and a massive infrastructure bill. But the president's broader spending plan, known as Build Back Better, has stalled. And Mr. Biden is just beginning to rally support for his first Supreme Court pick, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who would become the first Black woman on the nation's highest court if she's confirmed by the Senate. And of course, in addition to a full domestic agenda, the president's address comes as Ukraine struggles to fend off Russian forces who have invaded the sovereign nation and are killing civilians. Over the next hour, we will focus mainly on Ukraine, what the latest is, and what potential paths there are going forward. Russian forces pounded cities in Ukraine today as the war raged for a sixth day. Kharkiv in the northeast was particularly hard hit, and the port city of Mariupol in the southeast appeared surrounded. Nevertheless, a drive by Russian forces toward the capital, Kyiv, appears to be stalled. According to the Pentagon and to the Ukrainian forces kept up their fierce resistance. And in Ukraine is where we begin our coverage with a report from our foreign correspondent Nick Schifrin, who's in the western city of Lviv.
For years, Moscow's military has employed scorched earth. Today, it brought that brutal reality to Ukraine. Kharkiv's central square, named Freedom, now mostly rubble and dust. Inside the city's main government building, emergency workers removed debris and carried dead bodies. In total, city authorities said at least 5 were killed and more than 24 wounded, all civilians. Surveillance footage captured the attack, a direct hit, and a massive fireball. Russia promised its targets would be restricted to military. This is a residential building. Homes completely destroyed. Families and children killed.
We're being bombed by the Russians. We're all afraid. Why us? We're all simple civilians.
They destroyed a residential building. The rockets hit and many peaceful residents died. Putin and Lavrov are bandits and should be tried.
300 miles away in Kyiv, Russian missiles hit the city's main radio and TV tower. Firefighters fought to extinguish the fire at the site that's near a memorial to Ukrainian Jews killed by Nazis in World War II. Ukrainian President Zelensky today called this history repeating itself. Outside the city, satellite images show a convoy even larger than previously believed, 40 miles long. But a senior defense official said today the advance toward Kyiv was stalled. The official said Russia wants to encircle Kharkiv. Russian troops have begun to occupy cities in the south, Berdyansk and Melitopol, and are just outside Mariupol. But once again, Zelensky remained defiant, this time to European lawmakers. Even the interpreter got emotional.
We are fighting just for our land and for our freedom, despite the fact that all large cities of our country are now blocked. Believe you me, every square of today, no matter what it's called, it's going to be called, as today, Freedom Square in every city of our country.
Today, ordinary Ukrainians fought for their freedom despite being outgunned. Civilians tried to stop Russian armored vehicles, their only weapons, their bodies. Across the country, Ukrainians are rallying, even though some of their cities are slowly being strangled.
6 months ago, we prepare a city
to live in an extraordinary situation. We make huge supplies, medical treatment, blood. We bought a lot of diesel generator. We completely changed situation.
Andriy Sadovy is the mayor of Lviv, western Ukraine's largest city. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, usually a hub for tourists. But now it's a hub for thousands of Ukrainians trying to flee the war in central and eastern Ukraine.
Every day, thousand people from a different city. It's my heart completely разрывается.
Your heart is broken.
Small children, 2, 3, 5 years.
What support would you like from the West?
Less talking, more doing.
I listening about sanction last 1, 2, 3 months. We are deeply concerned, blah, blah, blah. Russia kill children, women. Russia oligarchs must feel very strong sanction and very strong position. Today, one part democratic world, next part totalitarian world. Today we told about future. Today we creating our future. Today Ukrainian people, David attack Goliath.
David attacks Goliath.
Yes.
Right outside the mayor's office, one of David's platoons, an assembly line of civilians crafting camouflage nets for Ukraine's military, young people who already embraced a European future. And grandparents born Soviet now embracing Ukraine. Jan Pasinaya is 67. Her granddaughter Maria Tigar is 13.
When I was born in the Soviet Union, we were united. I never felt the borders between nations. Today, I have hatred for those who started it all. I feel sorry for all Ukrainians because I'm a Ukrainian as well, and I'm proud of that.
I was raised in a in a free country, and I think freedom is very important, and now Russia is trying to take our freedom.
The family lives in Kyiv. On Thursday morning, Russians shelled their home, forcing them to flee.
We packed all our stuff in 15 minutes, and we left our house locked, and I don't know when we will come back.
How do you think one person doing something here in Lviv can help Ukraine take on Russia?
If one person starts doing something extraordinary and something that can actually help, if many people do it, the society is power. And if we deliver a message to society, it will respond.
If Ukraine is David and Russia is Goliath, do you believe, do you have faith that Ukraine can win?
I believe, and today a lot of people from world believe to Ukraine. It is our victory.
It is miles away from that victory, but looking on social media, you can see countless acts of heroism and bravery by Ukrainian citizens all over the country. The video we showed was not of a tank man taking on the Russian military, but a tank squad in Kharkiv. And Judy, of course, leading this whole way, Volodymyr Zelensky, he got 2 standing ovations today from the European Parliament.
And one can see why. Nick, you've been talking to a number of officials. What are you being told about the state of the Russian operation now?
Yeah, senior U.S. officials tell me that they see examples of Russians inside Ukraine really struggling with some basic logistics. There are examples, they say, of Russian soldiers not having enough food to eat, convoys not having enough gasoline, and also some soldiers back home not getting paid. Officials believed or feared that there could be a real shock and awe campaign against Kyiv, and they just said that they haven't seen evidence that the Russians are actually executing that at the moment. And they praise Ukraine's resistance and certainly praise Zelensky's leadership. But there is still a lot of fear that the bombings you saw today could continue or increase. There will be more troops arriving in Ukraine and even more amphibious assaults in the south. And Judy, the Russian Defense Ministry today did warn that they would be targeting military targets in Kyiv, and they told civilians living near those targets to evacuate.
Something I know they are paying close attention to. So, Nick, where you are in Lviv is in the far western end of the country, far from what you've been describing, but you were telling us you're still seeing threats in that area.
Yeah, the mayor told us that they are very concerned about insider threats, so to speak, people inside the city committing acts. And he said that they'd arrested 10 people that he says were Russian agents, or at least being paid by Russia. And he said that they had planned to blow up a power station and what he called sabotage activities near a hospital. Again, no evidence of that right now, at least out in public, but authorities here clearly worried about what could come. But again, Judy, as you say, the main part of the fighting is in the center and the east, and it is getting worse.
Nick Schifrin reporting from Lviv, where it is well into the night. Thank you, Nick. And throughout the evening, we are also going to be turning to our correspondents here in Washington, D.C. for an analysis of President Biden's State of the Union address. Let's bring in two of them now. Amna Nawaz, she's on Capitol Hill at the Cannon House office building, and Jeff Bennett is at the White House. Hello to both of you. So, Amna, I know this speech, we've been talking about it, looming over it is the situation in Ukraine. You've been talking to foreign, to international representatives. What are you learning about how much the world is paying attention to the president's speech?
Judy, that's absolutely right. The Ukraine situation looms large over the president's speech tonight. He's not just speaking to lawmakers in the room, to millions of Americans watching at home, but to millions more watching around the world. And we know from excerpts released by the White House earlier today, the president will speak directly to that and specifically about the global unity that's come in response to President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Here is one excerpt we expect the president to mention tonight. He'll say that Putin's war was premeditated and unprovoked. He thought the West and NATO wouldn't respond, and he thought he could divide us here at home. Putin was wrong. We were ready. And we know some of those NATO and Western allies and leaders there will also be watching. I was speaking with one senior European official earlier today, Judy, and here is what they wanted to hear the president speak tonight. They would like to see resolve, unity, and statesmanship in the face of what they called groundbreaking aggression. But of course, Judy, where the president's rhetoric meets reality is on the ground in Ukraine. And as you mentioned, over the last week, I have been messaging regularly with a number of Ukrainians, some who remained in Kyiv, others who fled their homes in Kyiv and headed west. A few of them shared what they want to hear from the president tonight. Svetlana in Lviv said, "I hope he will say this is our joint fight, because if it's not our joint fight, then all the charters, the United Nations and others, they're just waste paper." Oksana, who is still in Kyiv, said what Ukrainians would like to hear most from President Biden is an invitation to join NATO. She would like to see President Biden speak more forcefully and offer more support for the Ukrainian people. So, Judy, of course, we know the rest of the world will be watching. These Ukrainians I've been messaging with say they are staying up late. They want to hear live what the president has to say. Judy?
Sobering to think that he will be heard literally around the world when he makes these remarks tonight, coming up in less than an hour. And now to Jeff Bennett at the White House. Jeff, I know you've done a lot of reporting today on what more we can expect to hear from the president tonight and how he's prepared for this.
That's right, Judy. And I'm told the president will address directly the sense of fatigue, frustration, pessimism that so many Americans are feeling given the pandemic and given inflation, that a lot of people's paychecks aren't keeping pace with higher prices, that the president will also try to conjure some optimism for some better times ahead and try to rally a support for his policy vision. I can also tell you that White House officials who had a hand in writing this speech have lost track of the number of revisions, and that President Biden himself has had a hand, I'm told, in some of these rewrites. In for example, crossing out acronyms, because I'm told he wants to speak directly and clearly to the American people. So the speech, I'm told, will sort of fall into four buckets. One being democracy on the world stage. I expect a large part of this speech to focus on the crisis in Ukraine. President will talk about his efforts to build a global coalition to confront Russian aggression. He'll also talk about his plans to curb inflation, to raise wages and create jobs. He'll spell out a plan to build more cars and semiconductors here in the U.S. Beyond that, he'll talk about the current trajectory of the pandemic, with cases and hospitalizations down from the peak of the Omicron variant. And he'll also talk about the future of some key Biden administration priorities, to include climate change, immigration, and of course his historic nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to be on the Supreme Court to fill the vacancy that will be left by the retirement of Justice Stephen Breyer. So the president intends to use this moment tonight to speak to millions of Americans. This is a size of an audience he likely won't have for the rest of the year. And I've talked to a number of Democrats who want this speech to provide really a messaging document for them as they go forward across the country and try to retain control of both houses of Congress in the midterm elections.
All right, Jeff Bennett watching this. And Jeff, we will be coming back to you throughout the night as we listen to the president and try to understand what the reaction is. Jeff Bennett at the White House, thank you. And now let's turn to Representative Abigail Spanberger. She's a Democrat from the state of Virginia. She's also a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and she is a former CIA officer. Congresswoman Spanberger, thank you very much for joining us. As you think about the president's remarks tonight and you know what is going on in Ukraine, halfway around the world, how do you think that factors into what the president needs to say tonight?
Well, the president needs to speak firmly and aggressively about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And certainly we have seen over the past few weeks, as Russia was making movements towards its invasion, the president and the Biden administration had made extraordinary strides in bringing together our European partners and partners throughout the world and security partners to be unified in ultimately the opposition to this invasion, unified in our response in terms of sanctions and aggressive tactics in the face of this invasion. And I hope that he'll continue to demonstrate that leadership, speaking up for Ukrainians, speaking up for the democracy that they are defending on the ground, and vehemently making clear that the invasion that Vladimir Putin has led is an affront to all of our democratic values here at home, certainly in Ukraine and throughout the rest of the world.
And Congresswoman, I see you wearing the colors of the Ukrainian flag, the blue and the yellow. What inspired you to do that? And as a former CIA officer, someone who's looked at not only national security, but what the United States and freedom represents around the world, how do you see what's going on in Ukraine right now?
Well, Judy, I was living in Germany at the time that our country was attacked on 9/11. And in the days after, I had a meeting with some German local elected officials, and one of the women arrived at the meeting wearing red, white, and blue. And I remember at the time being so grateful that she had taken the step, an effort to try and demonstrate solidarity for the pain that the United States was feeling. And so today, when we have such a platform to demonstrate our support for the Ukrainian people, it's a little bit of my effort to sort of pay it forward and make sure that, you know, everyone who's fighting for their freedom on the ground in Ukraine knows that we're there with them. Because really what we are looking at is an attack on a democratic nation, on a sovereign country within Europe. We are seeing just horrible atrocities, the murder of children, attack on buildings and public spaces, and we're seeing extraordinary bravery and leadership from our allies in Ukraine. And so my hope and expectation is that tonight, when the president speaks forcefully denouncing Putin, his crony oligarch friends, and every person who has enabled him, that we, members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, will be united in our support for his comments, in support of democracy, Ukraine and every other democracy, including our own, and that we will be united in our denunciation and in the coming weeks, further actions against Russia and those who have enabled this invasion.
And Congresswoman Spanberger, we know this speech comes at a time of difficulty in the Biden presidency, coming off of a year of the pandemic, rising inflation. The economy has been hit criticism of the president last year over Afghanistan, but now dealing with Ukraine. Do you think that this is a moment when the president can recenter, reposition, redirect his presidency?
I think this is an opportunity for us to come together and recognize the leadership that the president has already demonstrated on the world stage. I think certainly as somebody, you mentioned that I'm a former CIA officer, I worked overseas in the national security space, and certainly there has been no time in recent years or perhaps ever where so many allies have been united, not just in words in support of Ukraine and in denouncing Russia, but actually united in taking meaningful steps, strategic steps to thwart Russia's efforts. And that level of leadership, I think, is admirable. It's important. It certainly demonstrates, as a proud American, the role of leadership that I think that we should always be presenting on the world stage. And here at home, we have faced challenges. We have faced challenges with inflation and the price at the pump and the cost of prescription drugs. And my hope is that in tonight's speech, the president will demonstrate leadership, confronting these challenges head on, acknowledging the pain that they cause Americans, but also creating a path towards a brighter future. We, as an American people, are always on that path towards an ever brighter, ever more prosperous future, and I hope that that's kind of the vision for our nation, our proud, proud country that he lays out.
Your voice has been one, Congresswoman, that has at times pointed out the president seemed to be tilting too far to the left, frankly, in his policies. Is it your sense that that this is a moment when there could, to repeat what I said a moment ago, could be a redirection? Or what are your expectations for the coming year?
So I think it's not so much an issue of left or right. It's an issue of moving things across the finish line, and that means, in the halls of Congress, getting a bill through the House, the Senate, and to the president's desk. I believe that the American people elected Joe Biden. Certainly in my district, people wanted to see a return to a normal future, some sense of stability. And that comes with legislating, getting bills across the finish line to the president's desk. We've seen extraordinary legislative accomplishments in our passage of the American Rescue Plan, in our passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as many other pieces of legislation that may not have captivated the headlines nearly as much. And so I think that when the president tonight in his speech, and certainly every member of Congress, I hope that we are all focusing on policy that will make meaningful impact in the lives of the people we represent, and that meaningful impact comes when we actually pass bills into law. That's our job here, and certainly we can advocate day in and day out for the priorities and the policies we want to pursue, but our goal and our measure of success is getting them across the finish line. And tonight I have a constituent who will be the guest of the First Lady, Joshua Davis, recently turned 13 years old. He's a young man with diabetes who has done advocacy in my district. And I'm really proud of the fact that I was able to introduce him to the President of the United States when President Biden came to my district, and to now recognize that he'll be bringing a voice to people who are facing diabetes across the country, and bringing a voice and a face and a story to the reality of what the cost of prescription drugs means for families across Virginia, across my district, and across the country. That's the sort of story that I hope the president will uplift, and then ultimately we will work hard to get legislation that will change people's lives, that will impact people like Joshua Davis and his family in Virginia and across the country, get those bills to the president's desk so they can actually become law.
We did see that Joshua was going to be one of the guests of the First Lady tonight. We'll be looking for him. Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Meantime, the human toll of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is already massive, with more than 600,000 people who've left the country and many more who are still in Ukraine but who cannot safely stay in their homes. We hear now from two Ukrainian parents in different parts of the country, both unsure of what the next day will bring, and both trying to keep their children safe.
I'm in Kozub. I'm living in Kharkov. People are very frightened who is in apartment because they hear constant bombing, and I understand how lucky we are because we in a subway station and don't hear it. Every day, twice or three times a day, we get food milk, water, and even sweets for children. Today it was the best day. Small children get cakes. When I see news, when I see videos, I'm crying. And сумасшедшие. And I'm trying to be positive with my daughter. And sometimes when I go to sleep, I'm crying a little bit, make my stress out. And every morning when I get up, I say, hi, my daughter, I'm trying to make him as comfortable here. And we are happy that we don't hear what is going on up there. I don't know if I will be okay. From time to time, I think I'm dreaming. I have to wake up and this is what I never feel this feeling. And I think everyone, and when we talk to people, and everyone say the same. They think they are dreaming. We can't believe in 21st century it could be.
I'm Vladislav Sadnik. I'm from Kiev myself. The big war has caught us while we were on a family retreat, skiing in the mountains in the western part of Ukraine, and we've planned this vacation since the summer, like most normal families do, and we hope that nothing like that would ever happen to Ukraine. So what I've been doing for the past several days is collecting money from everywhere in Ukraine, from the diaspora, from just people just from all across the world, and trying to purchase everything we can in the neighboring countries with vests, bulletproof vests, helmets, and just simple stuff like that. What is absolutely incredible is how quickly all of us just simply, changed their normal way of being. I have a regular job like everyone else, which I go to 9 to 5. I travel a lot. I do a blog about heavy metal music for myself. Yet all of these things just suddenly became absolutely unimportant. And you understand that the only thing which is important to you is the safety of your family first, and then the safety of your country. The scariest thing is to hear your daughter, who is, I have 2 daughters, one of them is 4 and the other one is 1, just asking you, hey, why can't we go home? And when will the Russians go away from our land? And why did they come? And just having this struggle of, how do you explain a thing like that to a 4-year-old? And how do you make it so it doesn't scar her for life?
Those are 2 sets of parents in Ukraine, absolutely heartbreaking and completely human. And now we heard a moment ago from Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, Democrat of Virginia. Now for a Republican perspective on Ukraine, I'm joined by Congressman Andy Barr of Kentucky. He serves on the Foreign Affairs Committee and on the Financial Services Committee, where he helps oversee sanctions policy. Congressman Barr, thank you very much for joining us. I don't know if you were able to hear some of these parents speaking right now, but it has to go straight to one's heart, to your heart, because they were speaking like any other parent. What is your sense right now of what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, as a parent myself, it is totally heartbreaking. It's barbaric what's happening, and really one can describe what's happening as war crimes. Those are the reports that we are receiving as well, and what the world is witnessing is something we haven't seen since World War II, which is a full-scale invasion by land, air, sea, through cybersecurity and missiles, an invasion of a sovereign, democratically elected country, government and a country, And again, this is the largest military mobilization and invasion of a sovereign country since World War II. I agree with my Democrat colleague and friend that we need to hear from President Biden a forceful position in solidarity with the Ukrainian resistance, but we need more than forceful speaking. We need a stronger set of actions, both in terms of support for the Ukrainian resistance with arms and weapons, small arms support, ammunition, anti-armor, anti-aircraft Stinger missiles, which have not been delivered in the quantity needed. These Ukrainians are fighting literally with broomsticks and kitchen knives and Molotov cocktails. What they need are weapons. What they need are Stinger missiles in order to counter the significant firepower of Putin's war machine. And then on the sanctions front, we're glad that the Treasury Department has imposed sanctions on Russian banks and the Russian Central Bank. We appreciate the Europeans leading on reimposing those sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and we're glad that the Biden administration has followed suit after they waived those sanctions, removing the important deterrence that those sanctions provided. But what we need now is more forceful sanctions that deal with this energy loophole. The problem with the sanctions, Judy, right now is that there is a general license to all energy-related transactions. That's where Putin gets most of his foreign currency reserves, which is literally financing this war effort. We need to close that loophole, and I'm hoping the president will announce that tonight.
Well, let me bring you first back to the call for more weapons to be provided. They would have to be defensive weapons, as we understand it, because of NATO restrictions. We know that they are already being provided Stinger missiles, other weaponry by not just the United States and NATO. What exactly more are you saying they need?
Well, they're asking for more weapons. The Ukrainian Prime Minister, the President Zelensky, asking for more lethal defensive weapons, those Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft, anti-armor, more javelins, more small arms. We need to provide them with defensive small arms. And we were asking for this during the mobilization. This was an 8-month mobilization of Russian troops on the border of Ukraine, not just in the Donbass, but also the exercises that were happening in the north, in Belarus, and also in the Crimea. We knew this was coming. Putin telegraphed this. We were calling for those Stinger missiles. Now, when they're under siege, it's harder to get those weapons to the Ukrainian resistance. So we're pushing for more of that. And again, we need tougher sanctions. We need to close these loopholes.
What evidence do you see, Congressman, that the sanctions that are being imposed, and I think everyone agrees these are the harshest sanctions yet to be imposed on Russia, are having any deterrent effect on Vladimir Putin?
Well, clearly these sanctions alone were not deterring Putin, but one of the reasons is that we waived sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The Biden administration waived those sanctions. I was the author of the legislation that authorized those sanctions. Those sanctions were put into place. Construction on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was halted and then waived last May. That was a green light for Putin to invade because the construction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline enabled Putin to continue to send Russian gas to continental Europe, and he didn't need the pipelines that went through the Ukraine. Fortunately, those sanctions have been reimposed. But again, one of the ways in which Putin is financing this war effort is through the energy transactions, the energy sales. And frankly, the United States continues to this day, post-invasion, to be importing over 500,000 barrels of Russian oil every day. That is revenue of up to over $60 million a day. And so in effect, until we block those imports, we continue, the United States and our allies in Europe continue to finance this war effort. We need to stop that. And as Russia draws down on the hard currency that they have in their central bank, we don't need to have a faucet of foreign hard currency flowing into that country.
So just to quickly wrap this up, you're saying the United States is in part enabling what Vladimir Putin is doing?
Yes, because we're continuing, even to this day, post-invasion, we are purchasing oil from Russia. We need to immediately suspend that. We need to apply sanctions to energy-related transactions and stop the flow of Russian oil into the United States and into Europe. And that is where we can really have an effect on the Russian economy. Furthermore, we need to replace that Russian oil with domestically produced American energy. The best way that we can counter Russian aggression here is to unleash domestic energy production, reverse the policies of the Biden administration constraining the supply, the domestic supply of energy, not just Keystone XL pipeline, but production of and exploration of energy on federal lands and more leasing, and also ending financial regulators, weaponizing financial regulation to redirect capital away from American energy companies. That's happening under the Biden administration's policies. I'm hoping tonight that President Biden reverses course so that we can become energy dominant once again. That's the best way that we can help our allies in the Ukraine and in Europe in countering Russian aggression and deterring further aggression from Russia.
Congressman Andy Barr of Kentucky, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And now for a more in-depth look at the ongoing war on Ukraine, we are joined by retired Lieutenant General Doug Lute. He had a 35-year career in the Army, and he served on the National Security Council staff during both the George W. Bush and the Obama administrations. He also was U.S. Ambassador to NATO during the Obama administration. And Angela Stent worked in the State Department during the Clinton administration and served as a top U.S. intelligence officer on Russia during the George W. Bush administration. She's now a professor at Georgetown University. Hello to both of you and welcome to this special this evening. To you first, General Lute, tell us what your best understanding is at this hour of Russia's military advance on Ukraine.
Well, Judy, I think it's important to appreciate we're only 6 days into this, but these first 6 days have been revealing in several ways. First of all, they've revealed that Putin attacked with some faulty assumptions. First of all, I think the assumption that the Ukrainian government would collapse, that the Ukrainian military would not fight, that the Ukrainian people would not resist, that proved false. I think he attacked with the assumption that his forces would have a relatively easy ride. That's not proven true. And then finally, I think he attacked with the assumption that the West would simply not get its act together, would not be solid, would not be coherent. And in fact, we've seen just the reverse. We've seen an unprecedented coherence of both on the diplomatic front and now with economic sanctions coming out of the West. So he was wrong on all three fronts.
And right now, we see the Russians, yes, they've been slower than some people expected, but they seem to be determined in their move toward the major cities in Ukraine.
Well, look, he has the military capability. He has the firepower, the manpower, and so forth to lay siege to these large Ukrainian cities, Kharkiv in the east and Kyiv, the capital city. So he can do this. The issue is not his capability, but to what extent does his capability, is it offset by the Ukrainian will to fight, the Ukrainian will to resist? You know, history has a lot of examples where the lesser armed protagonist in a conflict actually prevails over the better armed opponent because of higher morale, increased will to fight. Right now, my bet's on the Ukrainian people.
And Angela Stent, as someone who has studied not only Russia, but you've studied Vladimir Putin, and we don't have eyes on him, certainly not close eyes. There's no access for the press where he is. But what is your sense as we see increasing attacks on civilians in Ukraine, on residential buildings? What's going on in the mind of Vladimir Putin? Is there no fear on his part of the kind of reaction there's going to be when that is the shape of the Russian advance?
You mustn't forget that President Putin came to power during and then launched the second war in Chechnya. And what did they do? They leveled Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, to the ground, brutal fighting tactics. They subdued the Chechens. That's what he knows. That was his experience. That was really how he consolidated his own power. So frankly, I think in his playbook, it doesn't matter if you kill civilians. You know, the Russians are saying formally, we're not killing civilians. Your show has, you know, provided ample evidence that this is exactly what's happening. Families, the heartrending stories we heard. He and the people around him don't care about this. If we see them surrounding Kiev, we can go back to various playbooks. Are they going to try and starve Kiev out, as Leningrad was starved out when just before he was born, which his parents lived through? That's one tactic. They're bombing, you know, indiscriminate buildings. So I think it's part of their playbook. It's part of his experience, and hopefully they will continue to meet a lot of resistance from the Ukrainians who are bravely fighting back, and they'll get all the supplies from NATO countries that they're entitled to, but they're not going to stop because of this. It just may take them much longer than they realized.
Should we take, we are hearing a number of analysts say what they think Vladimir Putin wants to do, and to some extent he signaled this himself, and that is set up a government in the country that is sympathetic to him. He said that he believes the Zelensky government is illegitimate. Should we take him at his word that that's what this is about?
Oh, I'm sure that that's what it's about. It's been about that from the beginning, to conquer Ukraine and then set up a puppet government that will do Moscow's bidding. And we had a hint of this. RIA Novosti, which is an official news agency, got a little bit ahead of itself. It published an article, obviously written before the invasion, 2 days after the invasion, proclaiming victory. We're in a new world. The West is broken apart. We have a friendly Ukrainian government. That article has now gone off their website, but funnily enough, they left it up maybe longer than they should have. So we have some idea then what it was that they thought would happen. And they thought that the Ukrainians would greet them with open arms. They would be reunited with Mother Russia. And then they would go, you know, forward in glory into the New World Order. It's going to be much more difficult to do that.
Doug Lute, in the bit of time that we have left, we've heard a number of prescriptions tonight from different directions about what else needs to happen to help the Ukrainians. What do you see, what more do you see that NATO, that the United States could do to support the Ukrainian resistance?
Well, Judy, I think in long, prolonged conflicts, brutal conflicts like this, logistics are typically the thing that spells the success or failure. And it's the logistics on both sides. I mean, there are early signs that President Putin's forces have logistics challenges. Those are likely to get only more severe as time goes on and as distances grow from their supply bases. We have a responsibility to help the Ukrainians with logistics. Here on the humanitarian front, we've seen some 600,000 Ukrainians are now refugees in NATO countries. They need to be cared for. That's a logistics challenge. And then the logistics challenge of continuing to sponsor, continuing to support the Ukrainians in their fight. So shoulder-fired anti-tank systems, as the congressperson was talking about, likewise Stinger surface-to-air missile systems. These are the systems that the Ukrainians can best employ and can best distribute under the pressure of the Russian campaign. And we've got to make sure those are ready.
Such an enormous challenge, but so important to hear the perspective of the two of you. Retired General Doug Lute, Angela Stent, we thank you both.
Thank you.
And in explaining why he launched this invasion, President Putin falsely claimed that Ukraine was always a part of Russia. And just as he did the first time he invaded Ukraine, Putin made bogus assertions about pro-Russian Ukrainians being under threat. To help sort fact from fiction and get a better understanding of how we got to this point, the NewsHour's Ali Rogan looks at the history of Ukraine and of its people's political independence.
In 1991, at the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, Ukraine declared independence after nearly 70 years under Moscow's control. And when Russian President Vladimir Putin took power a decade later, he began trying to get it back. Ukraine, he says, is part of Russia's family.
We will believe that Ukraine is not only our closest neighbor, but is indeed our brotherly republic.
At a NATO summit in 2008, he reportedly told then-President George W. Bush that Ukraine was not even a country. And he repeated those claims last week before launching the invasion.
Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood. Modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia.
That claim ignores the centuries of history through which modern Ukraine took shape. It was first home to the Kievan Rus people, who were Scandinavian traders and Russia's namesake. Over time, it was absorbed by Poland and Lithuania, and then the Russian Empire and Austria-Hungary. A post-World War I treaty briefly recognized its independence, long enough to spark Ukrainian nationalist movements. The Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic was born in 1922. Under Soviet rule, Ukrainian identity was under constant threat. In 1932, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin deliberately imposed famine there, killing at least 3 million Ukrainians in a single year. Indeed, by World War II, some Ukrainians welcomed Nazi occupation as a way to challenge Soviet control. But the Nazis slaughtered more than 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews. Millions more non-Jewish Ukrainians were also killed or put to hard labor. By 1954, the country that exists today was part of the USSR. The final piece was Crimea, a peninsula on the Black Sea which Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred from Russia to Ukraine. But even after Ukraine declared independence in 1991, pro-Russian political elements remained, which Putin exploited. In Ukraine's 2004 presidential elections, he supported the pro-Russian Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych ran against Viktor Yushchenko, a pro-Western opposition politician.
It would be a great mistake if Ukraine misses a train bound for Europe.
Yanukovych won, but international monitors said the election fell short of its standard. Yushchenko's supporters took to the streets. They sparked the Orange Revolution, so called for the campaign's colors, holding protests and storming parliament. The Ukrainian Supreme Court deemed the results invalid, and Yushchenko won the next election. During the election, Yushchenko became ill, and his face became disfigured. It was found to be dioxin poisoning. His supporters blamed the pro-Russian government.
Who is responsible? The Ukrainian authorities are, who have been doing everything not to let Yushchenko win.
He did win, though, and continued pushing west.
The political goal is the final integration to the European Union and NATO. The main question is not in the direction of movement, but in the speed of it.
But in eastern Ukraine, support for Russia remained strong. In 2010, Yanukovych ran again and won.
My task is to make sure that Russia-Ukraine relations take a radical turn in the right direction.
One of those radical turns came in 2013. Yanukovych stopped trade talks with the EU, instead pursuing a similar agreement with Russia. That night, crowds gathered in Kyiv's Maidan, or Independence Square, which continued to grow into a sprawling camp.
We are ready for war, but we're hoping for the best. A government should be afraid of the people, not the people afraid of the government.
But the head of the Russian government vilified the Ukrainian people.
In my view, this is an attempt by the opposition to shake the current, and I want to emphasize legitimate authorities in the country.
As 2014 began, authorities grew more violent. In late February, Ukrainian security forces shot and killed dozens. Then the opposition and government reached a truce, and Yanukovych fled, reappearing a few days later in Russia.
I intend to keep fighting for the future of Ukraine against those who are using fear and terror to seize the country.
But the one trying to seize Ukraine was Putin. He sent unidentified armed men to occupy airports in Crimea, which Putin has long said was stolen from Russia. Putin denied sending in troops, but said he would if asked, setting up a pretext just as he did for this invasion.
What can be a reason to use the armed forces? This is, of course, the last resort, simply the last resort. If we see that lawlessness starting in eastern regions too, if people ask us for help, we reserve the right to use all options at our disposal to protect those citizens.
Those so-called requests for help soon followed. On March 6th, the Crimean parliament voted to secede from Ukraine and join Russia. Days later, a public referendum, rife with alleged fraud, passed with 95.5% of the vote. That July, the US, EU, Canada, and other allies imposed sanctions on Russia. More unidentified vehicles arrived in Crimea, escorted by Russian police cars. And Russian troops took over more buildings. As it is today, the Putin regime said it was helping Crimeans defend themselves, with little evidence they needed defending.
Will Russia be able to remain indifferent to the situation when, in neighboring Ukraine, Russians are facing a deadly threat? The answer is simple. No, Russia cannot remain indifferent, and it will not remain indifferent.
2 months later, Ukraine elected its next president, pro-European businessman Petro Poroshenko.
We should do everything possible to bring European values to Ukraine.
But the events in Crimea had inspired pro-Russian separatists in 2 other regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, collectively known as the Donbass.
We want to have an independent Republic of Donetsk. We want to be independent from Ukraine.
The political protests took on a military dimension. Russian-backed separatists began an insurgency against the Ukrainian military. There were diplomatic attempts to reach a ceasefire, but those never held. The fighting continued into 2019 when Poroshenko lost re-election to TV star and neophyte politician Volodymyr Zelensky, who'd once played and accidentally elected president of Ukraine. He campaigned on domestic issues, but also wanted to restore peace to the Donbass.
Most likely, if I meet Mr. Vladimir Putin, I will tell him the following. Well, you finally gave us back our territories. How much money are you ready to give as compensation for the fact that you took our territories and that you assisted people who participated in escalation in Crimea, Donbass, and assisted them on the awful, cruel, and disgusting path?
3 years later, Putin is forcing the Ukrainian people further down that cruel path, while Zelensky fights to lead them out. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Ali Rogan.
What a helpful look at the history of that country. And bringing us back to Washington, it was just moments ago that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi called the House chamber to order. That's ahead of President Biden's speech at the Capitol tonight. And our Lisa Desjardins is inside the House chambers. Lisa, tell us what you are seeing.
Judy, I'm seeing something we haven't seen for 2 years. For the first time in 2 years, the United States Congress has been able to gather as a body. Members are spread out. There are no guests in this chamber, with the exception of some guests that the White House will bring in the First Lady's box. This is members only. That also is rare. Something else. I see very few masks in this chamber. Today, for the first time in well over a year, the order that masks be worn in this chamber was lifted. That has to do with the kind of decrease in COVID in this country and in this area. Everyone in this chamber had to test negative in order to be here. You hear a hush now. Until now, it has been probably one of the most vibrant chambers I've been in a long time, as members were enjoying being face-to-face. You can see, and I think you will see in some of the pictures here, a lot of yellow, a lot of blue. That is a show of support for Ukraine, and I think viewers should watch. I have seen Representative Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania pass out small Ukrainian flags that many members have. I think we will see those waved during the speech.
And as we just saw Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger wearing a blue and yellow. We see blue on House Speaker Pelosi and Congressman Andy Barr. We just spoke with him from Kentucky wearing the Ukrainian colors in a ribbon on his lapel. Lisa, we should tell our audience the reason we don't see you right now is because we don't have news cameras inside the House chamber. So we're talking to you by telephone. But we know, Lisa, in past State of the Union addresses, not all members show up for these. What's your sense of what the attendance is going to be like tonight?
This is a large attendance. This chamber looks full to me. However, it is spaced out. Members are sitting every other seat for the most part. And, you know, there were many questions about how many Republicans would be here. I see many Republicans. I believe a majority of the Republican conference is here, though I don't think there's much more than that. So it looks like maybe 100 members. They also have messages they've brought. Representative Lauren Boebert of Colorado, I noticed, has a black scarf that if you look at it carefully, it says on it, "Drill, baby, drill." So as much as this speech will be about Ukraine, and there is unity in this body in general about Ukraine, there is also, we will hear tonight, and we are seeing signs of the very real and sharp political divide still in this country.
Can't get rid of it anytime soon. Lisa Desjardins, we're going to be coming back to you throughout this evening. Thank you, Lisa. And as we await the president's arrival, we're going to get additional analysis over the next few minutes from Washington Post columnist Jonathan Capehart and Peter Wehner. He is a contributor to The Atlantic and to the New York Times. Hello to both of you as we wait for the president to arrive in the House chamber. Jonathan, to you first, how does the fact that the war is raging in Ukraine halfway around the world, what effect does that have on the president's job tonight?
Well, what we've seen since the Russians invaded Ukraine is an American president who's been leading. And so while the United States is not at war and President Biden is not a wartime president, the fact that the United States has been able to rally NATO, rally the EU, rally the Western Alliance against the Russian aggression against Ukraine, it allows the president to use, not in a pejorative sense, but to use the moment to not just galvanize the world, but to galvanize the United States and talk about this in the larger frame, and that is democracy. Now, what is happening in Ukraine is democracy versus autocracy. And one of the main things that drove President Biden into the campaign, remember, he said, was to fight for the soul of America. And so there are people who are fighting for democracy halfway around the world. And he's going to talk about his leadership there. But then he also has to talk about and use that energy to convince the American people that the job he's doing here at home in terms of the domestic agenda, getting inflation under control, getting rising prices under control, that he is the leader and is doing everything to get those things under control. So he's got the State of the Union address is always a big moment for the president. But this speech for President Biden, his first official State of the Union address, is coming at a very momentous time for the nation and the world.
No question about it. Pete Wehner, how big a test do you see this for the president, given all that is going on and given this moment in American history?
It's a really big test. to be a test for any president, because this is the largest land war in Europe since 1945. And, State of the Union speeches always matter, but they're usually forgotten. This one may be remembered. If it's remembered, it'll be remembered because of Ukraine. Often speeches make moments, but more often moments make speeches. And this is a big moment for Biden, for the United States, and really for the world. The other thing I'd say, just piggybacking on what Jonathan said, is I would say that the biggest problem that Joe Biden has had over the last year is a sense that he's been overmatched by events. He's 13 points lower in approval rating now than he was a year ago. It's a huge loss. And there are particular issues that are behind that. But I think underneath it all is a sense that he has not been in control of events. And he has shown, I think, in a very impressive way that he is, in fact, in control of events. Things still have to unfold, and a lot can happen. But the way he has rallied NATO and the EU against this Ukrainian crisis, or the Russian aggression of Ukraine, has really been impressive.
And Jonathan, I know some are saying this could be an opportunity for the president, if you will, to turn the page, but it's a tricky thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't see how he's going to be able to turn the page when what we're seeing is day 6 of a Russian invasion of a democracy of Ukraine. But at the same time, Americans at home, again, dealing with high prices, high gasoline prices, dealing with supply chain issues, dealing with high inflation. And so what the president needs to do is not turn the page, but to convince the American people that while he's got a lot of good economic data to crow about, that he understands that at the kitchen table level, he knows that there's pain and he's got a plan to ease that pain.
And Pete Wehner, in that vein, can the president, is it possible for a president to say to the American people, I'm going to take a slightly different approach going forward? I mean, how do you do that and still be authentic?
Well, I think you can. I mean, you can give voice to what's going on in the country, and it's very important. I've worked on State of the Union speeches, which are hard, and they're hard because they can be undisciplined, and you can also get too defensive, try and convince people that you've done well. But no, what he can do is he can signal that he knows that things are different, that he hears the American public and lay out agenda. But in the end, it's events that matter. He's just got to be able to say what he's going to do, but then he has to execute on what he wants to do.
Pete Wehner and Jonathan Capehart, and we will be coming back to talk with the two of you after the President's State of the Union. We thank you both. And to all of you who are watching, please stay with us. Our coverage of President Biden's State of the Union continues in just a moment right here on PBS.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
And welcome to our PBS NewsHour special live coverage of President Biden's State of the Union address. Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff in Washington. The president is going to be arriving at the U.S. Capitol, the House chambers, momentarily. We are going to be turning to our correspondents throughout the night for their reporting on the president's speech. Our Amna Nawaz is on Capitol Hill. She's in the Cannon House office building. Jeff Bennett is at the White House, and our own Lisa Desjardins is inside the House chambers, where she is going to be speaking to us by phone. For additional analysis, we're going to be joined again tonight by Washington Post columnist Jonathan Capehart and by Peter Wehner. He's a contributor to The Atlantic and to the New York Times. And since it is just after 9 o'clock in the East, and I'm looking at my phone to see if my time is right, it is just about the moment when they announce the arrival of President Biden in the House chamber. You see there, these are live pictures coming to us from the Capitol. That's Speaker Nancy Pelosi in Ukrainian blue on the right. And on the left, Vice President Kamala Harris. The traditional positions since early last year when the president gave a joint address to Congress. It wasn't a State of the Union, but it was an address where House and Senate members came together to hear the new president speak. This is the second time we've seen the joint chambers, the two chambers come together in joint session. We're seeing assorted members of Congress, members of the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, the Chief Justice John Roberts. We're seeing a parade of, and Justice Stephen Breyer, who is retiring at the end of this term of the Supreme Court. We've been reporting on the nomination of the first black woman, Ketanji Brown Jackson, to take Justice Breyer's place, and those confirmation hearings will be coming up in several weeks. But let's bring in some of our correspondents and analysts. Lisa Desjardins, you are there in the House chamber. You've got a bird's eye view of what's going on. Tell us what you're seeing that we should know about.
Well, it looks like they're running a few minutes behind. That's not a shock. This is the first time many of these members have been able to interact in this form, literally in years. There are few masks in this chamber. That's because the mask requirement was lifted just today because of the situation with COVID here in the District of Columbia, low enough to allow that. Also, every person in this chamber had to test negative in the past day in order to be here. There will be a great show, I think, of support for Ukraine. I see members holding flags. Those were given out by one of the Republican members of Congress. You will see a lot of yellow, a lot of blue. I also have noticed some interesting bipartisan moments. One of the president's chief advisors, Louisa Terrell, hugging the chief of staff for Republican Senator Mitch McConnell. So some of these moments that you see actually matter in terms of relationships at a time like this. A big speech, but I think more than anything, this feels like a sense of normal that many of these members have wanted, to just be able to gather together in this chamber.
So many things coming together at the same time, Lisa, as you say, people wanting so badly to get back to normal, to shake off the restrictions of COVID. But as we've been reporting now for several days, this speech comes in the middle of a crisis. around the globe, in Ukraine, where the Russians have invaded that sovereign country and are marching on their way to take over, in their attempt to take over cities, and as they've said, their goal is to take over the government. We are still waiting for President Biden. We're keeping an eye out on the House chamber, waiting for President Biden to arrive. Amna Nawaz, as we said, is at the Capitol in the Cannon House office building. And Amna, I think you've been reporting for the last, well, ever since the invasion happened, and trying to get a sense of international reaction to it. This is one of the rare times when news that is not centered right here in the United States is going to be front and center at a State of the Union.
You're absolutely right, Judy. I mean, the confluence of factors that have to be top priorities for the president right now is really unprecedented. I mean, think about it. He's talking during a time of pandemic recovery after a once-in-a-generation, once-in-a-century pandemic.
Going to interrupt you, Amna, just one second.
I'll toss it back to you, Judy.
Come right back to you in a minute. We've just heard the President of the United States announced by General William Walker. He's the House Sergeant at Arms. And here comes President Biden greeting members of Congress, many of whom he knows. He served for more than 3 decades in the Senate. He knows many of these members on both sides of the aisle there. You see him greeting many of them personally. And as Lisa Desjardins pointed out, this is one of the only times we've seen members of Congress, or certainly that we've seen the president without a mask in a large setting like this. But Amna, I want to come back to you. I didn't mean to interrupt you, making the point that you were about how unusual it is that this terrible conflict in Ukraine is going to be frankly subject number 1 for the State of the Union.
That's absolutely right, Judy. It sets up a real challenge for the president, right? Because this is chiefly meant to be an address to the American people, sort of a victory lap after his first year. And so many of the same challenges the president came into office and inherited and stepped into remain with him today. And now on top of that, you have this world-altering event with the Russian invasion into Ukraine. What strikes me as I'm watching this feed, though, is the number of Ukrainian flags you see lawmakers holding, the number of lawmakers who are wearing blue and yellow in solidarity with Ukraine. And I should also say I've been getting messages from some of my contacts on the ground in Ukraine who are watching this tonight, are watching our live stream and staying up late. It's 4 in the morning in Kyiv right now, and they wanted to be able to see what President Biden has to say live. So the challenge for him is enormous. He has to both message to an American public who are pandemic weary, who are dealing with record inflation, and also speak to the rest of the world about how the U.S. is going to continue to lead, continue to rally those NATO and Western allies and deter Russia in the midst of this ongoing invasion in Ukraine. And we should mention, too, foreign policy is something that's not typically high on Americans' list as a recommended and a wanted priority for the president, but lately it does rank up there. Obviously, the economy and inflation are the top concern for Americans, but in the sort of quartet of issues that follow, Americans still say foreign policy is something that they want the president to pay attention to and should be a priority.
Amna Nawaz watching it all from the Cannon House office building. You see the president receiving a warm greeting there in the House chamber. Both Democrats and Republicans, all of them seem to be standing and applauding as they wait for the president to speak.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, General. Thank you. Thank you.
Jorge, que el presidente le comunique a los estadounidenses las nuevas medidas que estaría tomando Estados Unidos frente a Rusia. Vamos a escucharlo.
Buenas tardes. El ejército militar ha comenzado un asalto brutal contra el pueblo de Ucrania sin provocación, sin justificación, sin necesidad. Esto es un ataque premeditado. Vladimir Putin ha estado planeando esto durante meses, como siempre lo hemos estado diciendo nosotros. Él desplazó más de 175,000 tropas, equipo militar a posiciones con Ucrania. Él llevó abastecimientos de sangre y plasma allá y hospitales de campo ha construido él, que le dice todo lo que tienen que saber ustedes sobre la intención que él siempre ha tenido. Él rechazó todo esfuerzo de buena fe por parte de los Estados Unidos, aliados y socios para abordar estas preocupaciones de seguridad mutuas, para tener un diálogo para evitar conflicto innecesario y evitar sufrimiento humano. Durante semanas hemos estado nosotros precaviendo que esto va a ocurrir y ahora está ocurriendo tal y como lo predijimos nosotros. Hemos visto que el bombardeo ha ocurrido en el Donbass, la región del oriente de Ucrania, controlada por separatistas. El gobierno ruso ha llevado a cabo ataques cibernéticos contra Ucrania. Vimos nosotros que en Moscú estaban diciendo sin base ciertos reclamos que Ucrania le permitió invadir y lanzar una guerra contra Rusia, que Ucrania estaba preparada a usar armamentos químicos contra Rusia, que Ucrania había cometido genocidio, sin ninguna evidencia alguna que pudiera probar esto. Vimos nosotros violaciones flagrantes de derecho internacional, tratando de unilateralmente crear dos nuevas llamadas repúblicas sobre territorio soberano ucraniano. Y en el mismo momento que el Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas estaba reunido para respaldar la seguridad de Ucrania, para evitar la invasión, Putin declaró su guerra. En momentos después, comenzaron a lanzar misiles en ciudades históricas por toda Ucrania. Entonces, los ataques aéreos, seguidos por tanques y tropas que estaban entrando a Ucrania. Hemos sido transparentes nosotros con el mundo. Hemos compartido evidencia desclasificada sobre los planes de Rusia para que no haya confusión alguna de lo que estaba haciendo Putin. Putin es el agresor. Putin eligió ir a esta guerra y ahora él y su país han de pagar por las consecuencias. Hoy día estoy autorizando sanciones fuertes adicionales y nuevas limitaciones, lo que se puede llevar a exportar a Rusia. Esto va a imponer un costo severo en la economía rusa, ambas inmediatamente con el pasar del tiempo. A profeso hemos diseñado estas acciones para maximizar un impacto a largo plazo a Rusia y minimizar el impacto que los Estados Unidos y nuestros aliados han de tener por esto. Y quiero decir claramente, los Estados Unidos no está haciendo esto solo. Durante meses hemos estado desarrollando una coalición de socios representando más de la mitad de la economía global. 27 de la Unión Europea, incluyendo Francia, Alemania, Italia, también como el Reino Unido, Canadá, Japón, Australia, Nueva Zelanda y muchos otros para amplificar este impacto mancomunado de nuestra respuesta. Acabo de hablar yo con los líderes del G7 esta mañana y nosotros estamos en pleno de acuerdo total. Vamos a limitar la habilidad de Rusia de tener negocios en dólares, euros, libras y en yenes para que no formen parte de la economía global. Vamos a limitar la habilidad de ellos de poder hacer esto. Vamos a detener la habilidad de que puedan financiar y desarrollar el ejército ruso. Vamos a imponer. Nosotros vamos a causar que ellos no puedan competir en la economía del siglo XXI. Ya hemos visto el impacto de estas acciones sobre la moneda y el rublo de Rusia. Hoy día llegó a su nivel más débil. Jamás en la historia había llegado a este nivel. El mercado de la bolsa de Rusia se desplomó hoy día. El gobierno de Rusia bajó, y bajó por más de 15%. Con las acciones de hoy día hemos sancionado a los bancos rusos. Estos tienen como $1.000 millones en activos. Un tercio de los activos de los bancos de Rusia han sido eliminados del sistema financiero estadounidense. Y hoy día también estamos bloqueando 4 bancos principales allá. Quiere decir que todos los activos que tienen ellos en Estados Unidos serán congelados. Esto incluye el BTB, el segundo banco mayor en Rusia, que tiene $250.000 millones en activos. Como lo prometimos, también estamos agregando nosotros se fue.
We will keep up this drumbeat of those designations against corrupt billionaires in the days ahead.
Vamos El martes
detenemos
al gobierno ruso para que no pudiera conseguir dinero de los inversionistas europeos y estadounidenses. Vamos a aplicar ahora restricciones a las empresas mayores de Rusia, compañías con activos que exceden 1,4 millones de dólares. Algunos de esos impactos más poderosos por estas acciones ocurrirán con el pasar del tiempo, al apretar nosotros el acceso de Rusia al financiamiento de la tecnología en sectores estratégicos de su economía y su capacidad industrial durante los próximos años. Entre nuestras acciones y las acciones de nuestros socios y aliados, calculamos que vamos a eliminar más de la mitad de las importaciones de alta tecnología de Rusia. Vamos a darle una gran gandanada a su ejército. Vamos a degradar
We're also taking steps to defend our penalties we're imposing. We're also taking steps to defend our NATO allies, particularly in the East. Tomorrow, NATO will convene a summit. We'll be there to bring together the leaders of 30 allied nations and close partners to affirm our solidarity and to map out the next steps we will take to further strengthen all aspects of our NATO alliance.
I have a horrible echo. I cannot do it.
Defensive assistance to Ukraine just this year, last year. Let me say it again.
Dice el presidente Biden, nuestras fuerzas no se van a enfrentar en el conflicto en Ucrania. Nuestras fuerzas no van a ir a una guerra en Ucrania, pero van a defender a nuestros aliados de la OTAN. Como lo he dejado muy claramente, Estados Unidos va a defender cada pulgada de territorio de la OTAN.
La OTAN estuvo más unida y más determinada que jamás antes. No hay duda alguna que los Estados Unidos y todos los aliados de la OTAN van a cumplir con el compromiso del artículo 5 que dice que un ataque en uno es un ataque a todo. En las últimas semanas he ordenado millares de fuerzas adicionales a Alemania y a Polonia como parte de nuestro compromiso hacia la OTAN. El martes, en respuesta a la acción agresiva de Rusia, el presidente, he autorizado yo que se destaquen fuerzas en Europa y que vayan a los aliados de Ucrania, Polonia, Rumanía y Estonia. Nuestros aliados también han estado actuando. Y el resto de aliados, el resto de la OTAN, han llevado fuerzas y capacidad militar para tener una defensa mancomunada. Hoy día, pocas horas después que Rusia comenzara su asalto, la OTAN se reunió y autorizó y activó un plan de respuesta activada para permitirle a las fuerzas de la OTAN destacarse cuando y donde fuesen necesarias para proteger a nuestros aliados de la OTAN en la frontera oriental de Europa. Y ahora estoy autorizando yo fuerzas adicionales estadounidenses para que vayan a Alemania como parte de la respuesta de la OTAN, incluyendo algunas fuerzas tal y como lo prometimos hace unas semanas atrás. También he hablado con Austin, el secretario de la Defensa, y el secretario del Estado Mayor Conjunto Miller para prepararnos para nuevas ayudas en caso de que fuesen necesarias para proteger a los aliados de la OTAN y respaldar la alianza mayor en la historia del mundo, la OTAN. Al responder nosotros, mi administración está usando las herramientas, todas las herramientas disponibles para proteger a las familias estadounidenses y los negocios de los precios que están siendo elevados. Bombas de gasolina. Estamos tomando pasos activos para bajar el costo y las compañías de petróleo estadounidenses y de gas no deben de explotar este momento para subir sus precios, para elevar sus ganancias. Con respecto a nuestro paquete de acciones, están diseñados especialmente para continuar los pagos por asuntos energéticos. Estamos monitoreando de cerca los abastecimientos de energía. Hemos estado coordinando con los productores principales de petróleo y los países consumidores para tener un abastecimiento seguro de energía. Estamos trabajando con países en todo el mundo para que puedan utilizar sus reservas energéticas. Y los Estados Unidos va a liberar nuevos barriles, adicionales barriles, cuando sea necesario. Yo sé que esto es difícil para el pueblo. Los estadounidenses ya están con problemas, pero yo haré todo lo posible para limitar el dolor que el pueblo estadounidense está sintiendo en las bombas de gasolina. Esto es para mí importantísimo. Pero esta agresión no puede seguir seguir adelante sin respuesta alguna. Si eso ocurriera, las consecuencias de los Estados Unidos serían mucho peor. Los Estados Unidos no permiten que aquellos que acosen a los demás. Nosotros respaldamos la libertad, así somos nosotros. También quiero repetir lo que dije la semana pasada. Si Rusia sigue con ciberataques contra nuestras empresas y la infraestructura crítica, estamos preparados a responder nosotros. Durante meses hemos estado trabajando de cerca con el sector privado para que ellos mejoren sus ciberdefensas, mejorar la estabilidad para responder a los ataques cibernéticos de Rusia también. Hablé anoche con el presidente Zelensky de Ucrania y le aseguré que los Estados Unidos, junto con nuestros aliados y socios en Europa, hagan de respaldar al pueblo ucraniano al defender ellos a su país. Vamos a dar alivio humanitario para evitar su sufrimiento. Durante los primeros días de conflicto, la propaganda rusa tratará de ocultar la verdad y decir que tienen éxito ellos en su operación militar contra esta amenaza. Pero la historia ha demostrado que una y otra vez más, como por fin esto resulta en ocupaciones masivas y desobediencia masiva. En estas próximas semanas y meses, nosotros vamos a estar con el pueblo de Ucrania. Putin los ha perjudicado muchísimo, pero el pueblo ucraniano ya llevan 30 años independientes y ellos han demostrado en repetidas ocasiones que no van a tolerar a nadie que trate de hacerle daño a su país. Este es un momento peligroso para toda Europa, para la libertad de todo el mundo. Putin ha asaltado los principios de la paz mundial. Ahora, todo el mundo ve claramente cómo Putin y sus aliados criminales actúan y cómo son ellos. Esto nunca trataba de una preocupación de seguridad por parte de ellos. Siempre trataba de plena agresión, el deseo de Putin de aumentar su imperio por cualquier medio necesario. Al hacer que los vecinos de Rusia cooperen, cambiando las fronteras por fuerza y eligiendo una guerra sin causa alguna. Putin tiene una visión siniestra que perjudica el futuro de nuestro mundo. Cuando las naciones toman lo que quieren por fuerza, es una visión que los Estados Unidos y las naciones que aman la libertad han de oponerse con toda herramienta de nuestro poderío considerable. Los Estados Unidos y nuestros aliados y socios van a salir de todo esto más fuertes, más unidos, más determinados y con un mejor propósito. La agresión de Putin contra Ucrania terminará costándole muchísimo a Rusia desde un punto de vista económico y estratégico. Vamos a cerciorarnos de esto. Putin será un paraya ante todo el mundo. Cualquier nación que ayuda a Rusia será manchada por asociación. Lo que ha elegido Putin de hacer una guerra totalmente injustificable contra Ucrania ha de dejar a Rusia más débil y el resto del mundo mucho más fuerte. La libertad, la democracia y la dignidad humana son las fuerzas mucho más poderosas que el temor y la opresión. No vamos a permitir que Putin y sus ejércitos y tiranos nos hagan daño. Esto no puede eliminarse del corazón de las personas a través de ninguna violencia e intimidación. Entre autocracia y democracia. No se equivoquen ustedes, la libertad siempre ha de prevalecer. Que Dios bendiga al pueblo de una Ucrania libre y democrática, que Dios proteja a nuestras tropas. Zik, de Prensa Asociada. ¿Usted quisiera hablar con el presidente Putin en este momento? ¿Qué interacción ha tenido usted con el gobierno? Me escuché la primera parte. Tengo planes de hablar con Putin en estos momentos. Ya es un conflicto grande. La manera que vamos a cerciorarnos que esto no va a convertirse en un conflicto mayor es dándole todas las fuerzas necesarias, ayudando a las naciones OTAN en Europa, más unidos que nunca antes, y no tengo plan alguno de hablar con Putin.
Wall Street Journal.
El Wall Street Journal, Terina.
Mr. President, you didn't mention
Señor
SWIFT
presidente,
in your
usted no
sanctions that you
mencionó
announced. Is there a reason
estas sanciones
why the
nuevas en Europa. ¿Usted
U.S.
conoció
isn't
alguna
doing
razón por la
that?
cual
Is there
Estados Unidos
disagreement among
no está haciendo
allies
esto? Hay un desacuerdo entre los
regarding
aliados
SWIFT and whether
con respecto a SWIFT
Russia should be allowed
y si
to be part of
Rusia
it?
debe de permitírsele a Rusia ser parte de esto. Las que hemos propuesto nosotros tienen una consecuencia mayor, mucho mayor que SWIFT en primer lugar. En segundo lugar, siempre es una opción, pero en estos momentos esa no es la postura que el resto de Europa desea tomar.
Cecilia. Not from the top down, because we know when the middle class grows, the poor have a way up and the wealthy do very well. America used to have the best roads, bridges, and airports on earth, and now our infrastructure is ranked 13th in the world. We won't be able to compete for the jobs of the 21st century if we don't fix it. That's why it was so important to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I thank my Republican friends who joined to invest and rebuild America, the single biggest investment in history. It was a bipartisan effort, and I want to thank the members of both parties who worked to make it happen. We're done talking about infrastructure weeks. We're now talking about an infrastructure decade. And look, it's going to transform America, to put us on a path to win the economic competition of the 21st century that we face with the rest of the world, particularly China. I've told Xi Jinping it's never been a good bet to bet against the American people. We'll create good jobs for millions of Americans, modernizing roads, airports, ports, waterways, all across America. And we'll do it to withstand the devastating effects of climate change and promote environmental justice. We'll build a national network of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations. Begin to replace the poisonous lead pipes so every child, every American has clean water to drink at home and at school. We're going to provide affordable, high-speed internet for every American, rural, suburban, urban, and tribal communities. 4,000 projects have already been announced. Many of you have announced them in your districts. And tonight, I'm announcing that this year, we will start fixing over 65,000 miles of highway and 1,500 bridges in disrepair. And folks, when we use taxpayers' dollars to rebuild America, we're going to do it by buying America. Buy American products. Support American jobs. The federal government spends about $600 billion a year to keep this country safe and secure. There's been a law on the books for almost a century to make sure taxpayers' dollars support American jobs and businesses. Every administration, Democrat and Republican, says they'll do it, but we're actually doing it. We'll buy America to make sure everything from the deck of an aircraft carrier to the steel on highway guardrails is made in America from beginning to end. All of it. All of it. But folks, to compete for the jobs of the future, we also need a level playing field with China and other competitors. That's why it's so important to pass the Bipartisan Innovation Act sitting in Congress that will make record investments in emerging technologies and American manufacturing. We used to invest almost 2% of our GDP in research and development. We don't now. China is. Let me give you one example why it's so important to pass. If you travel 20 miles east of Columbus, Ohio, you'll find 1,000 empty acres of land. It won't look like much, but if you stop and look closely, you'll see a field of dreams. the ground on which America's future will be built. That's where Intel, the American company that helped build Silicon Valley, is going to build a $20 billion semiconductor megasite, up to 8 state-of-the-art factories in one place, 10,000 new jobs. And in those factories, the average job about $135,000 a year. Some of the most sophisticated manufacturing in the world to make computer chips the size of a fingertip, that power the world in everyday lives, from smartphones, technology, the internet, technology is yet to be invented. But that's just the beginning. Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger, who is here tonight, I don't know where Pat is. Pat, there you go, Pat, stand up. Pat came to see me, and he told me they're ready to increase their investment from $20 billion to $100 billion. That would be the biggest investment in manufacturing in American history. And all they're waiting for is for you to pass this bill. So let's not wait any longer. Send it to my desk, I'll sign it, and we'll really take off in a big way. And folks, Intel is not alone. There's something happening in America. Just look around and you'll see an amazing story. The rebirth of pride that comes from stamping products made in America. The revitalization of American manufacturing. Companies are choosing to build new factories here, when just a few years ago they would have gone overseas. That's what's happening. Ford is investing $11 billion in electric vehicles, creating 11,000 jobs across the country. GM is making the largest investment in its history, $7 billion to build electric vehicles, creating 4,000 jobs in Michigan. All told, 369,000 new manufacturing jobs were created in America last year alone. Folks, powered by people I've met like JoJo Burgess from generations of union steelworkers in Pittsburgh, who's here with us tonight. Where are you, JoJo? There you go. Thanks, buddy. As Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown says, it's time to bury the label Rust Belt. It's time to see what used to be called the Rust Belt become the home of a significant resurgence of manufacturing. And with all the bright spots in our economy, record job growth, higher wages, too many families are struggling to keep up with their bills. Inflation is robbing them of gains they thought otherwise they would be able to feel. I get it. That's why my top priority is getting prices under control. Look, our economy roared back faster than almost anyone predicted. But the pandemic meant that businesses had a hard time hiring enough people because of the pandemic to keep up production in their factories. So you didn't have people making those beams that went into buildings because they were out. The factory was closed. The panic also disrupted the global supply chain. Factories close. When that happens, it takes longer to make goods and get them to the warehouses, to the stores, and prices go up. Look at cars last year. 1/3 of all the inflation was because of automobile sales. There weren't enough semiconductors to make all the cars that people wanted to buy. And guess what? Prices of automobiles went way up, especially used vehicles as well. And so we have a choice. One way to fight inflation is to drive down wages and make Americans poorer. I think I have a better idea to fight inflation. Lower your costs, not your wages. And folks, that means make more cars and semiconductors in America, more infrastructure and innovation in America, more goods moving faster and cheaper in America, more jobs where you can earn a good living in America. Instead of relying on foreign supply chains, let's make it in America. Look, economists call this increasing the productive capacity of our economy. I call it building a better America. My plan to fight inflation will lower your cost and lower the deficit. 17 Nobel laureates in economics said my plan will ease long-term inflationary pressures. Top business leaders, and I believe most Americans support the plan. And here's the plan. First, cut the cost of prescription drugs. We pay more for the same drug produced by the same company in America than any other country in the world. Just look at insulin. 1 in 10 Americans has diabetes. In Virginia, I met a 13-year-old boy, the handsome young man standing up there, Joshua Davis. He and his dad both have type 1 diabetes, which means they need insulin every single day. Insulin costs about $10 a vial to make. That's what it costs the pharmaceutical company. But drug companies charge families like Joshua and his dad up to 30 times that amount. I spoke with Joshua's mom. Imagine what it's like to look at your child who needs insulin to stay healthy and have no idea how in God's name you're going to be able to pay for it. What it does to your family, but what it does to your dignity, your ability to look your child in the eye, to be the parent you expect yourself to be. I really mean to think about that. That's what I think about. You know, yesterday, Joshua's here tonight, but yesterday was his birthday. Happy birthday, buddy, by the way. For Joshua and 200,000 other young people with type 1 diabetes, let's cap the cost of insulin at $35 a month so everyone can afford it. And drug companies will do very, very well, their profit margin. While we're at it, I know we have great disagreements on this floor with this. Let's let Medicare negotiate the price of prescription drugs. They already set the price for VA drugs. Look, the American Rescue Plan is helping millions of families with Affordable Care Act plans to save them $2,400 a year on their health premiums. Let's close the coverage gap and make these savings permanent. And second, let's cut energy costs for families, an average of $500 a year by combating climate change. Let's provide an investment tax credits to weatherize your home and your business, to be energy efficient and get a tax credit for it. Double America's clean energy production in solar, wind, and so much more. Lower the price of electric vehicles, saving another $80 a month that you're not going to have to pay at the pump. Folks, the third thing we can do to change the standard of living for hardworking folks is cut the cost of child care. Cut the cost of child care. Folks, if you live in a major city in America, you pay up to $14,000 a year for child care per child. I was a single dad for 5 years, raising 2 kids. I had a lot of help, though. I had a mom, a dad, a brother, and a sister that really helped. But middle class and working folks shouldn't have to pay more than 7% of their income to care for the young children. My plan would cut the cost of child care in half for most families and help parents, including millions of women who left the workforce during the pandemic because they couldn't afford child care, to be able to get back to work. Includes home and long-term care, more affordable housing, pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds. All these will lower costs to families. And under my plan, nobody, let me say this again, nobody earning less than $400,000 a year will pay an additional penny in new taxes. Not a single penny. I may be wrong, but my guess is if we took a secret ballot in this floor, that we'd all agree that the present tax system ain't fair. We have to fix it. I'm not looking to punish anybody, but let's make corporations and wealthy Americans start paying their fair share. Look, last year, and like Chris Coons and Tom Carper and my distinguished Congresswoman, we come from the land of corporate America. There are more corporations incorporated in America than every other state in America combined. And I still won 36 years in a row. The point is, even they understand they should pay just a fair share. Last year, 55 of the Fortune 500 companies earned $40 billion in profit and paid zero in federal taxes. Now look, it's not fair. That's why I proposed a 15% minimum tax rate for corporations. And that's why in the G7 and other meetings overseas, I was able to be somewhat helpful. 130 countries agree on a global minimum tax rate. So companies can't get out of paying their taxes at home by shipping jobs and factories overseas. It'll raise billions of dollars. That's why I propose closing loopholes for the very wealthy who pay a lower tax rate than a teacher and a firefighter. So that's my plan, but we'll go in more detail later. We will grow the economy, lower the cost of families. So what are we waiting for? Let's get this done. We all know we've got to make changes. Folks, and while you're at it, confirm my nominees for the Federal Reserve, which plays a critical role in fighting inflation. My plan will not only lower costs and give families a fair shot, it will lower the deficit. The previous administration not only ballooned the deficit with those tax cuts for the very wealthy and corporations, it undermined the watchdogs, the job of those to keep pandemic relief funds being wasted. Remember we had those debates about whether or not those watchdogs should be able to see every day how much money was being spent, where was it going to the right place? But in my administration, the watchdogs are back. And we're going to go after the criminals who stole billions of relief money meant for small business and millions of Americans. Tonight, I'm announcing that the Justice Department will soon name a chief prosecutor for pandemic fraud. And look, I think we all agree, thank you. By the end of this year, the deficit will be down to less than half of what it was before I took office. The only president ever to cut the deficit by more than $1 trillion in a single year. Lowering your cost also meant demanding more competition. I'm a capitalist, but capitalism without competition is not capitalism. Capitalism without competition is exploitation. It drives up profits. And corporations have to compete. Their profits go up and your prices go up when they don't have to compete. Small businesses and family farmers and ranchers, I need not tell some of my Republican friends from those states. Guess what? You got 4 basic meat packing facilities. That's it. You play with them or you don't get to play at all. And you pay a hell of a lot more. A hell of a lot more because there's only 4. See what's happening with ocean carriers moving goods in and out of America. During the pandemic, about half a dozen or less foreign-owned companies raised prices by as much as 1,000% and made record profits. Tonight, I'm announcing a crackdown on those companies overcharging American businesses and consumers. And folks, and as Wall Street firms take over more nursing homes, quality in those homes has gone down and costs have gone up. That ends on my watch. Medicare is going to set higher standards for nursing homes and make sure your loved ones get the care they deserve and that they...
Esta nómina. Vamos a aumentar el sueldo mínimo a $15 por hora y extender el crédito fiscal por niños para que nadie tenga que criar una familia en pobreza. Vamos a aumentar las becas PER, invertir en lo que Jill le llama, nuestra primera dama, que enseña a tiempo completo, le llama el mejor secreto de los Estados Unidos, las universidades comunitarias. Vamos a aprobar la ley PRO. Cuando la mayoría de trabajadores quieren formar un sindicato, no deben de ser detenidos. Cuando invertimos en nuestros trabajadores, desarrollamos la economía de abajo hacia arriba y del medio hacia arriba, juntos, para hacer algo que nunca se ha hecho durante mucho tiempo, para construir una mejor Estados Unidos. Durante muchos años, 2 años, COVID ha impactado cada vez en nuestra vida y en esta nación. Yo sé que están cansados, frustrados y se sienten exhaustos. Eso ni siquiera cuenta el 1 millón de personas que están sentadas en su mesa, cenando, viendo a una silla vacía porque perdieran un ser querido. Pero yo también sé lo siguiente, debido al progreso que hemos logrado, debido a su resistencia, resiliencia y las herramientas que este Congreso nos ha dado a nosotros. Esta noche le puedo decir que estamos nosotros desplazándonos con mayor seguridad a favor de nuestras rutinas más normales. Hemos llegado a un nuevo movimiento en la lucha contra el COVID-19, contra los casos severos. Han bajado a un nivel que no se había visto desde julio pasado. Hace unos pocos días, el Centro de Control y Prevención de Enfermedades emitió unas nuevas pautas para las mascarillas. Bajo estas nuevas pautas, la mayoría de los estadounidenses, la mayoría del país, ahora puede estar sin usar mascarillas. Y en base a las proyecciones, más del país llegará a un punto, a este punto, en las próximas 2 semanas. Gracias al progreso que logramos el año pasado, el COVID-19 ya no tiene que controlar nuestras vidas. Yo sé que algunos de ellos están hablando de vivir con COVID-19, pero esta noche yo digo, nunca debemos de meramente aceptar vivir con COVID-19. Tenemos que combatiendo el virus, así como lo hacemos con otras enfermedades. Y ya que este virus se muta y se disemina, tenemos que mantenernos en guardia. Hay 4 pasos comunes que tenemos que seguir. En mi opinión, en primer lugar, manténganse protegidos con vacunas y tratamientos. Sabemos cuán increíblemente eficaces son las vacunas. Si usted está vacunado y tiene su vacuna de refuerzo, tiene el mayor alto grado de protección. Nunca vamos a rendirnos. Tenemos que vacunar a más estadounidenses. Yo sé que padres con niños menores de 5 años de edad quieren ver las vacunas autorizadas para sus hijos. Los científicos están trabajando arduamente para lograr esto y estaremos listos con muchas vacunas cuando lo logren hacer ellos. Ya estamos listos nosotros también. También estamos listos con tratamientos antivirales. Si usted se contagia de COVID-19, la píldora de Pfizer reduce su probabilidad de estar en un hospital por 90%. Yo he ordenado más píldoras que cualquiera en el mundo haya ordenado. Pfizer está trabajando tiempos adicionales para llevarnos a 1 millón de píldoras este mes y más del doble de eso el próximo mes. Y ahora estamos lanzando nosotros la iniciativa de prueba para tratar. Las personas pueden recibir pruebas en su farmacia y si son positivas recibir la píldora antiviral ahí mismo sin costo alguno para ellos. Mis amigos, si usted está inmunocomprometido o tiene algún otro tipo de vulnerabilidad, tenemos tratamientos y mascarillas gratis de alta calidad. No estamos dejando rezagados a nadie, ignorando las necesidades de nadie. Con respecto a las pruebas, tenemos centenares de millones de pruebas disponibles y las pueden ordenar de gratis, entregadas a su casa. Si ya ordenaron ustedes pruebas gratis, le estoy anunciando que pueden ordenar más grupos. Cuando vayan ustedes a covidtest.gov, comenzamos esta próxima semana, puede tener más pruebas de gratis. En segundo lugar, tenemos que prepararnos para nuevas variantes. Anteriormente, podíamos detectar de mejor manera las nuevas variantes. Si fuese necesario, podremos desarrollar nuevas vacunas en 100 días en vez de meses o años. Y si el Congreso nos da los fondos necesarios, tendremos nuevas cantidades almacenadas de pruebas, máscaras y píldoras si se necesitan. No le puedo prometer que una variante no vendrá, pero sí le puedo prometer que haremos todo lo posible para estar alistados si viene una nueva variante. En tercer lugar, podemos terminar los cierres de escuelas y negocios. Tenemos las herramientas necesarias. Ya ha llegado el momento que los estadounidenses vuelvan a trabajar para llenar los centros de nuevo con personas. Las personas trabajando desde casa pueden sentirse seguros y volver a trabajar en sus oficinas. Lo estamos haciendo acá en el gobierno federal. La mayoría de los trabajadores federales una vez más trabajarán en persona. Nuestras escuelas están abiertas. Mantengámoslas de esa manera. Los niños tienen que estar en las escuelas. Con 75% de los estadounidenses adultos totalmente vacunados y las hospitalizaciones han bajado por un 77%, la mayoría de los estadounidenses pueden quitarse las mascarillas, permanecer en las aulas y seguir adelante, sintiéndose seguros. Hemos logrado esto porque dimos vacunas gratis, tratamientos, pruebas y mascarillas gratis. Naturalmente, esto cuesta dinero. Así que, sí, no se sorprendan si volvemos a verlo de nuevo. Le voy a pedir al Congreso que nos den más, aporte más dinero. La gran mayoría de los estadounidenses que usan estas herramientas la necesitan de nuevo. Así que espero que el Congreso apruebe esto rápidamente. En cuarto lugar, vamos a continuar vacunando al mundo. Hemos enviado 475 millones de dosis de vacunas a 112 países, más que ninguna otra nación. Y no vamos a detenernos, porque no podemos desarrollar un muro lo suficiente alto para mantener fuera las vacunas. Las vacunas pueden detener la diseminación de estas enfermedades. Perdimos tanto con el COVID-19. El pasar tiempo uno con el otro. Y peor que todo, perdimos tantas vidas. Usemos este momento para recomenzar. Dejar de mirar al COVID como una línea divisoria aparte. Vamos a verlo por lo que es, una enfermedad horrible. Vamos a dejar de vernos como enemigos. Vamos a comenzar a vernos como quienes de veras somos, compatriotas estadounidenses. Nosotros no podemos cambiar cuán dividido hemos estado desde hace mucho tiempo, pero sí podemos cambiar nuestro futuro con respecto a COVID-19 y otros asuntos a que nos tenemos que encarar juntos. Recientemente visité yo el Departamento de Policía de la Ciudad de Nueva York, días después del funeral del oficial Wilbur Mora y su socio oficial Jason Rivera. Estaba respondiendo a una llamada de 911 cuando un hombre les disparó y lo mató con un arma robada. El oficial Mora tenía 27 años de edad, el oficial Rivera tenía 22 años de edad. Ambos eran dominicanos estadounidenses quienes se criaron en la misma calle y luego eligieron patrullar como oficiales de policía. Hablé con sus parientes y le dije a ellos que siempre estaremos adeudados por su sacrificio y seguiremos adelante con su misión para restaurar la confianza y seguridad de todas las comunidades como lo merecen. Pero algunos de ustedes que me conocen, yo he trabajado con ustedes sobre estos asuntos hace mucho tiempo. Yo sé que funciona investigar y prevenir los crímenes, ayudar a los policías que conocen el vecindario, que pueden restaurar la seguridad. Vamos a abandonar las calles o elegir entre la seguridad y justicia para todos. Vamos a unirnos y proteger nuestras comunidades, restaurar la confianza y hacer que los policías sean responsables. Por eso el Departamento de Justicia ha exigido cámaras corporales, ha prohibido los movimientos de ahogo y ha restringido y ha eliminado estas entradas en las casas sin los documentos necesarios. Por eso, el plan de rescate estadounidense provee $350.000 millones a las ciudades, estados y países que pueden usarlo para emplear más policías, incluyendo estrategias como interrupción de violencia comunitaria, evitando la violencia del trauma, dando a los jóvenes esperanza. Tenemos que estar de acuerdo. La respuesta no es quitarle los fondos a la policía, la respuesta es darle fondos a la policía. Darle fondos a ellos. Dar los fondos y recursos y capacitación que necesitan para proteger nuestras comunidades. Y le pido a los demócratas y republicanos, a ambos, que aprueben mi presupuesto para mantener seguros nuestros vecindarios. Haré todo lo posible para eliminar el tráfico de armas fantasma que se pueden comprar en línea, ensamblar en su casa, sin número de serie, que no se puede rastrear. Le pido al Congreso que aprueben medidas para reducir la violencia de armas, aprobar verificación universal de historiales. ¿Por qué cualquiera en la lista de terroristas ha de poder comprar un arma? ¿Por qué? ¿Por qué? Y mis amigos, eliminar armas de asalto y peines de alta capacidad, como 100 balas. Terminen protección que le dan a los fabricantes de armas, la única industria en Estados Unidos que no puede ser demandada. Imagínense si hubiéramos hecho esto nosotros con los fabricantes de tabaco. Estas leyes infringen la segunda enmienda, salvan vidas. El derecho más fundamental en Estados Unidos es el derecho a votar y que su voto sea contado. Y fíjense, está bajo asalto. En estado tras estado han sido aprobadas nuevas leyes, no solamente para suprimir la votación, y esto ha ocurrido anteriormente, pero para subvertir toda una elección. No podemos permitir que esto ocurra. Hoy día le pido al Senado que apruebe la ley de libertad para votar, apruebe la ley de derechos de votación John Lewis. Y mientras que están haciendo esto, aprueben ustedes la ley de divulgación estadounidense para saber quién está proveyendo fondos en nuestras elecciones. Hoy día quisiera honrar a alguien que ha dedicado su vida a servir a este país, el Supremo Stephen Breyer, veterano del ejército, erudito constitucional, Supremo del Tribunal Supremo de los Estados Unidos, que se está jubilando. Gracias, Supremo Breyer, por su servicio. Gracias, muchas gracias. Póngase de pie, por favor. Gracias. Y todos sabemos que no importa cuál es su ideología, sabemos que una de las responsabilidades constitucionales más serias que tiene un presidente es nominar a alguien para que sirva en el Tribunal Supremo de los Estados Unidos. Tal y como yo hice hace 4 días, cuando nominé a Ketanji Brown Jackson, juez del Tribunal de Apelaciones del Circuito, una de las mentes legales mejores de la nación, que ha de continuar con el legado de excelencia del Supremo Breyer. Ex litigadora en práctica privada, ex abogado de oficio federal de una familia de educadores y oficiales de la policía. Ella construye consensos. Desde que fue nominada ha recibido gran apoyo, incluyendo la Orden Fraternal de Policías y ex jueces nombrados por demócratas y republicanos. Mis amigos, si vamos a avanzar la libertad de la justicia, tenemos que asegurar la frontera y solucionar el sistema de migración. Como todos pueden pensar, creo que podemos lograr ambas. En nuestra frontera hemos instalado nueva tecnología, como escáneres, exploradores ultramodernos para detectar mejor a los contrabandistas de estupefacientes. Tenemos patrullas con México y Guatemala para atrapar a más traficantes humanos. Estamos colocando más jueces de migración para que las familias que huyen de la persecución y la violencia pueden tener sus casos rápidamente. Estamos comprometiéndonos, respaldando a socios en Sud y Centroamérica para que tengan mayor refugiados en sus países y aseguren sus fronteras. Podamos hacer esto mientras que mantenemos iluminada la antorcha de la libertad que ha llevado generaciones de inmigrantes a esta tierra. Mis parientes y los suyos. Darle un camino a la ciudadanía para los soñadores, los dreamers, aquellos en estados temporal, trabajadores agrícolas, trabajadores esenciales. Revisar nuestras leyes para que los negocios puedan tener trabajadores que necesitan y familias que no esperen décadas para reunirse. Es lo correcto que se debe hacer. Por eso estamos respaldando a los sindicatos laborales, líderes religiosos y en la Cámara de Comercio. Vamos a lograr que esto sea una realidad de una vez y para siempre. Avanzando la libertad y la justicia también requiere proteger el derecho de las mujeres. El derecho constitucional afirmado por Roe contra Wade, que ha presentado precedentes durante medio siglo, está siendo atacado como nunca antes. Queremos mejorar y no ir hacia atrás. Tenemos que proteger acceso a la atención médica, proteger el derecho a elegir de una mujer y continuar avanzando la atención a las madres en todos los Estados Unidos de América. Y mis amigos, para aquellos estadounidenses de LGBTQ+, por fin vamos a aprobar la ley de igualdad bipartidista para que yo la firme. Estas leyes tales que tienen como objetivo a los estadounidenses transgéneros y a sus familias tan equivocadas. Como dije el año pasado, a los jóvenes transgéneros estadounidenses, yo siempre he de respaldarlo a ustedes como su presidente para que ustedes puedan alcanzar su potencial que Dios les ha dado y puedan actuar como ustedes mismos quieren. Mis amigos, como acabo de demostrar, a pesar de que a veces parece que no estamos de acuerdo, y si estamos de acuerdo en muchas más cosas que lo que reconocemos, firmé 80 proyectos de ley bipartidistas para que se convirtieran en ley el año pasado, desde emitir cierres gubernamentales a proteger los asiáticos estadounidenses de estos crímenes de odio tan comunes, reformar la justicia militar y pronto vamos a fortalecer la ley de violencia contra las mujeres que yo escribí hace 3 décadas. Es importante que nosotros le demostremos a la nación que podemos unirnos y lograr cosas importantes. Esta noche le ofrezco una identificación para la nación. 4 cosas grandes que podemos hacer, en mi opinión. En primer lugar, ganarle a la epidemia de opioides. Hay tanto que podemos lograr. Aumentar los fondos para la prevención, el tratamiento, reducción y recuperación. Vamos a eliminar estas reglas anticuadas para que los médicos no prescriban más y no receten más los tratamientos. Eliminar el flujo de fármacos ilícitos, trabajando las policías estatales y locales. Si padecen ustedes de la adicción, saben que no está solo. Yo creo en la recuperación y yo celebro a los 23 millones de estadounidenses en recuperación. En segundo lugar, vamos a enfrentarnos a la salud mental, especialmente entre nuestros hijos cuya vida y educación han sido volteadas. El plan de rescate estadounidense le dio a las escuelas dinero para emplear a maestros y ayudar a los estudiantes a aprender. De los padres que sus escuelas actúen de esta manera. Todos podemos jugar un papel. Ofrezca sus servicios para ser tutor o mentor. Los niños también están luchando con la pandemia, con la violencia y el trauma y los perjuicios de los medios sociales. Como Frances Haugen, quien está aquí esta noche, nos ha demostrado, tenemos que hacer que las plataformas de esos medios sociales sean responsables por los experimentos nacionales que están llevando a cabo con nuestros hijos para su utilidad. Gracias. Gracias por el valor que has demostrado. Ya ha llegado el momento de fortalecer la protección de privacidad. Eliminar estos anuncios para los niños, exigir que las compañías técnicas dejen de recopilar datos personales sobre nuestros hijos y que todos los estadounidenses puedan obtener el servicio de salud mental que necesitan. Más personas necesitan ayuda y necesitan atención y mental y física. Y tenemos que tratarlas ambas como una. Pero la tercera parte de esa agenda es el respaldo a nuestros veteranos. Los veteranos son la piedra millar, la columna vertebral de este país. Son los mejores de todos nosotros. Yo siempre he creído que tenemos una obligación sagrada para equipar a aquellos que les mandamos a la guerra y cuidar de ellos y a sus familias cuando vuelven a sus hogares. La administración le dio ayuda, capacitación laboral, viviendas y ahora están ayudando a los veteranos a estar libres de deudas. Nuestras tropas en Irak y en Afganistán se han encarado a muchos peligros. Una de ellas estaban estacionadas en bases, respirando humo tóxico. Muchos de ustedes han estado ahí. Yo he estado en Irak y en Afganistán más de 40 veces. Estos sitios de quema queman desperdicios de la guerra, materiales peligrosos, médicos, y llegan a casa habiendo sido los mejores guerreros del mundo y nunca son los mismos. Tienen dolor de cabeza, entumecimientos, mareos, un cáncer que los colocará en una urna con una bandera encima de ellos. Yo sé, uno de esos soldados es mi hijo, el comandante Bo Biden. No sé con seguridad si él vivía cerca de uno de estos sitios de quema en Irak y en Kosovo, y este fue la causa de su cáncer del cerebro como tantas otras tropas. Pero sí estoy comprometido para averiguar todo lo posible, comprometidos a las familias militares como la familia de Daniel Robinson de Ohio, la viuda del sargento primera clase Heath Robinson. Él nació soldado, Guardia Nacional del Ejército, médico de combate en Kosovo y en Irak. Estaba ubicado cerca de Bagdad, a unos metros de estos sitios de quema del tamaño de unos campos de fútbol. La viuda de Daniel está aquí con nosotros esta noche. A ellos les encantaba ir a los juegos de fútbol de la Universidad de Ohio State. A él le encantaba construir Legos con su hija, pero el cáncer de exposición prolongada, sitios de quema, arrasó con sus pulmones y su cuerpo. Daniel dice que Heath fue luchador hasta el final. Él no sabía cómo dejar de luchar, y tampoco ella. A través de su dolor encontró propósito para exigir que actuemos de mejor manera. Esta noche, Daniel, vamos a actuar de mejor manera. La administración de veteranos está avanzando nuevas maneras de enlazar estas exposiciones a las quemas tóxicas, enfermedades, y esta noche estoy anunciando que estamos expandiendo la elegibilidad a que los veteranos que sufran de diferentes cánceres, 9 cánceres respiratorios, puedan tener tratamiento. Esta noche le pido al Congreso que apruebe una ley para que los veteranos devastados por exposición tóxica en Irak y en Afganistán por fin reciban los beneficios que necesitan y merecen. En cuarto lugar y por último, vamos a terminar el cáncer tal y como lo conocemos. Esto es algo personal. Esto es personal para mí, y para Jill, y para Kamala, y para tantos de ustedes. Tantos de ustedes han perdido a alguien, un ser querido, esposo, esposa, hijo, hija, padre, madre. El cáncer es la segunda causa de muerte en Estados Unidos, segunda a la enfermedad cardíaca. Este mes pasado anuncié el plan para supercargar el Cancer Moonshot que el presidente Obama me pidió que yo dirigiera hace 6 años. Nuestro objetivo es recortar la tasa de muerte por cáncer por un 50% en los próximos 25 años, y creo que podemos mejorar esto. Cambiar el cáncer de sentencia de muerte a enfermedades tratables, darle más apoyo a las familias y a pacientes. Para lograr esto, le pido al Congreso que aprueben los fondos a los que yo le llamo el ADPAH. la Agencia a favor de la Salud y proyectos de investigaciones avanzados, basada en DARPA, el Departamento de Defensa, que nos ha llevado a la Internet, al GPS y a tanto más. El ARPA-H va a poder lograr esto con mucha más claridad. ARPA tendrá un solo propósito: tener innovaciones en la lucha contra el cáncer, Alzheimer, diabetes y aún más. Una agenda unida a favor de la nación. Poder lograr estas cosas está en nuestra posibilidad y esto no puede ser partidista. Mis compatriotas estadounidenses, esta noche nos hemos reunido en este sitio sagrado, el Citadel de Democracia, en este Capitolio, generación tras generación de estadounidenses que han debatido grandes preguntas y han logrado cosas muy buenas. Hemos luchado a favor de la libertad, hemos aumentado la libertad, hemos derrotado el totalitarismo y el terror, hemos desarrollado la nación más próspera, más libre, más fuerte que el mundo ha conocido. Ahora ha llegado la hora, nuestro momento de responsabilidad, nuestra prueba de resolución y conciencia de la historia en sí. Este es el momento en que forjamos la personalidad de esta generación, encontramos nuestro propósito, forjamos nuestro futuro. Yo conozco bien la nación. Vamos a enfrentarnos a la prueba, vamos a proteger la libertad, vamos a desarrollar la libertad de la justicia y la oportunidad, vamos a salvar la democracia. Tan difícil como han sido estos momentos, yo me siento hoy día más optimista sobre los Estados Unidos que en cualquier otro momento de mi vida, porque veo el futuro que está en nuestra cercanía, porque yo sé que no hay nada que no podemos lograr nosotros. Somos la única nación en el mundo que siempre ha volteado cada crisis a que nos hemos encarado en una nueva oportunidad. La única nación que se puede decir por una sola palabra: posibilidades. Por lo tanto, esta noche, en nuestros 245 años como nación, yo vengo a reportar sobre el estado de la nación, el estado de la Unión. Y mi reporte es este: el estado de la Unión es fuerte, porque ustedes, el pueblo estadounidense, son fuertes. Hoy día estamos más fuertes. Estamos más fuertes hoy día que hace un año. Y estaremos más fuertes de un año de aquí que lo que soy. Este es nuestro momento para encararnos y sobreimponernos a los desafíos de nuestro tiempo. Y así lo haremos, como un solo pueblo, unos solos Estados Unidos, los Estados Unidos de América. Que Dios nos bendiga a todos y que Dios proteja a nuestras tropas. Gracias. Manos a la obra.
Bueno, así termina el discurso del Estado de la Unión, con este mensaje final de fortaleza del pueblo de los Estados Unidos y de unidad, que es el remate. Y hay unas cosas que es interesante señalar, Ilia. Este es un discurso muy diferente, en gran parte, al que tenía preparado el presidente Biden hace solo 10 días. Hace 10 días el énfasis iba a ser económico, el énfasis iba a ser la situación del país, pero hoy, por la situación, comenzó con el tema de Ucrania, como se esperaba.
Le dedicó casi los primeros 20 minutos de su discurso sobre el Estado de la Unión al tema de Ucrania. La primera ovación fue para la embajadora de Ucrania en los Estados Unidos, que estaba presente. Una foto que quedará para la historia, el abrazo de la primera dama, la doctora Jill Biden, con la embajadora de Ucrania, y el apoyo general que recibió muchísimas senadoras vestidas con los colores de la bandera de Ucrania, senadores y representantes también con la bandera de Ucrania en sus solapas, y muchas banderas en solidaridad.
Hay que decir que estos discursos siempre tienen una bancada que se levanta, otra que se queda sentada, pero en el tema de Ucrania fue unánime el aplauso, tanto republicano como demócrata, en un momento tan complejo como el que está viviendo el mundo actualmente.
Así es. Vamos a invitar a esta conversación a nuestros analistas, Carlos Díaz Rosillo, republicano, y Fabián Núñez, demócrata. Voy a empezar contigo, Carlos. ¿Cuál es tu primera impresión sobre el discurso del presidente?
Ilia, como yo esperaba, dos discursos. La primera parte, como mencionaste, un discurso apropiado, un discurso que tocó el tema de Ucrania y mostró una visión bastante coherente de lo que hay que hacer para parar a Putin y avanzar la democracia en el mundo entero. Una segunda mitad que saltaba de tema en tema, creo que de una manera un poco incoherente, y lo que me pareció más notable es que en la parte de inflación, la inflación es el problema que afecta al país con mayor severidad. Y no vimos ningún plan concreto. Sí, vimos puntos interesantes. Bajar el precio de la insulina, buenísimo. Pero el problema de la inflación no es el precio de la insulina ni de las drogas. Es que se inyectaron trillones de dólares en la economía y no vi ningún plan concreto para resolver ese problema, que es el número uno en la mente de los televidentes.
Vamos ahora con Fabián para conocer el punto de vista demócrata. ¿Fue lo que esperabas este discurso?
Sí, yo pienso que fue primeramente un discurso muy conmovedor. El presidente Biden, como él en veces resulta ser una persona muy sincera, una persona muy honesta, una persona que se encaja muy bien en los temas y se relaciona muy bien con la gente. Aquí lo que yo vi en este discurso, digo, aparte de la primera parte que estoy de acuerdo con Carlos en el sentido de que la respuesta a Putin fue una respuesta muy fuerte. Yo pienso que el resto del mundo tenía que escuchar esa parte del mensaje, pero en el tema doméstico hay que ver que la gran mayoría de los puntos que tocó el presidente fue para promover, en cierto sentido, la unidad de nuestro país. Claro que sus políticas son diferentes a las políticas republicanas. Por ejemplo, en el tema económico, cuando habla de que tenemos que levantar la economía de abajo para arriba. Eso yo sé que los republicanos no están de acuerdo con eso. O tanto el tema de el fortalecimiento de la clase media, el hecho de que tenemos que crear mejores trabajos, ¿no? Cosas que realmente hay diferencias, pero que en fin lo que él trató de hacer en este discurso es de promover un sentido de patriotismo nacional en nuestro país, y yo pienso que eso lo logró, lo hizo de manera muy contundente, y yo pienso que esto fue muy exitoso, este discurso del presidente Biden.
Y ahora que mencionamos el tema de la economía, quisiera preguntarle a Carlos, uno de los temas más polémicos quizás es el tema de los impuestos, de imponer más impuestos a los más ricos y no subir los impuestos a quienes ganen quienes ganen $400,000 al año o menos. ¿Qué piensas tú?
Mira, la parte de no subir los impuestos a los que ganan menos de $400,000 es muy buena, obviamente. Lo que no sé es cómo se van a pagar todos estos programas que suenan muy lindos, pero que cuestan. Lo peor que puedes hacer cuando la economía está débil es aumentar los impuestos a los más pobres, a los de la clase media, a los más ricos. Así que oímos muchísimos programas que tienen que pagarse, y la única manera de pagarse es con mayores impuestos. Así que Carlos, no sé cómo se va a hacer.
Carlos, quiero seguir contigo por lo siguiente. Desde que comenzó la presidencia Biden, él ha insistido en el tema de la unidad, buscar la unidad, tratar de juntar a las dos partes, entendiendo las diferencias. Pero ¿tú crees que esa realidad hoy de confrontación muy fuerte cambia en algo con lo que sucedió esta noche?
No creo, llevamos ya 1 año y 1 mes hablando de la unidad. Oímos un mensaje de unidad muy bonito en el discurso de inauguración. Oímos un mensaje de unidad muy bonito en el primer discurso ante el Congreso. Este segundo discurso otra vez oímos de unidad, pero por 1 año y 1 mes no se ha visto ninguna unidad de parte de los republicanos y de parte de los demócratas, ninguno. Así que creo que no va a cambiar nada. Me encantaría poder decirte que va a haber unidad y que vamos a trabajar juntos, pero en este momento el país está tan dividido que estas palabras de unidad, por bonitas que sean, no se ven reflejadas en la realidad.
Ahora, Fabián, quisiera irme directamente al tema de inmigración, porque durante la campaña el entonces candidato Joe Biden hizo muchas promesas. Durante su primer año durante su primera semana presentó el proyecto al Congreso, pero ese proyecto, él lo sabe, no cuenta con los votos suficientes. Inclusive 2 congresistas de su propio partido, congresistas Sinema y Manchin, no están de acuerdo con ese proyecto, no lo van a pasar, pero tampoco vimos una propuesta concreta, es decir, voten sí para lograr una vía a la ciudadanía para los Dreamers y para pasar la reforma migratoria, pero él lo sabe que no tiene los votos suficientes en su propio partido para pasarla.
Sí, no, eso es parte del problema en el Congreso, de que no existen los votos para hacer incluso muchos de los temas a los que se refirió en el discurso de hoy, ¿no? Son una lista larga de temas, de proyectos de ley que realmente no van a tener los votos necesarios. Pero yo pienso que lo que él enfatizó el día de hoy, y es importante indicarlo, es el hecho de que necesitamos una reforma migratoria, aunque no existan los votos actualmente. El hecho del tema migratorio sigue siendo un hecho verdadero y tenemos que buscarle una solución. Yo pienso que el presidente, ahorita estamos un poco distraídos con la invasión de Ucrania por parte de los rusos, muchas cosas que están sucediendo en este país, tanto como la inflación, pero el tema migratorio yo pienso que no deja de ser un tema de mayor importancia y los demócratas tenemos que seguir poniendo presión a nuestro propio partido y al Partido Republicano también, que hagamos nuestra parte para hacer una reforma migratoria integral.
Fabián,